Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Bedtime. I know many of you tune into these stories to help you drift off to sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I woke up to a strange noise coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was the wind or the old house settling, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart pounded as I realized someone was inside the house. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:12 a.m. My daughter, Lily, was sleeping in the room next to mine. Quietly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to her room. She was sound asleep, her small body curled up under the blankets. I gently shook her awake and whispered that we needed to be very quiet. Her wide, confused eyes met mine, but she nodded. I grabbed her hand and led her to the closet, whispering for her to stay there no matter what. I closed the door behind her. I moved back to my bedroom and picked up my phone, only to find that the battery was dead. Panic surged through me. I had left the charger downstairs in the kitchen. I could hear the intruders rummaging through our things, their voices low and urgent. I needed to protect Lily. I remembered the old baseball bat in the hall closet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crept out of the bedroom, moving as silently as I could. From the living room, I could hear them talking in hushed tones. My heart raced and my hands shook as I reached for the closet door. I grabbed the bat, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The floor creaked under my foot, and I froze. The talking stopped. Holding my breath, I prayed they hadn't heard me. After a few tense moments, their conversation resumed, and I let out a silent sigh of relief. Continuing down the hallway, I reached the top of the stairs and peered down. There were two of them, both wearing masks and gloves, rifling through drawers and cabinets, searching for valuables. I needed to get to the kitchen to charge my phone, but there was no way I could get past them unnoticed. Desperation crept in, so I decided to try and scare them off. Clutching the bat tightly, I shouted as loudly as I could, "Get out of my house. I've called the police." Their heads snapped up, and for a moment, they looked unsure. Then one of them started up the stairs, and I knew my bluff had failed. Backing up into the hallway, my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The man was getting closer. I swung the bat as he reached the top of the stairs, hitting him on the shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing, but didn't fall. He lunged at me, and we struggled. I was fighting for my life, and for Lily's. He wrestled the bat from my hands and threw it down the stairs. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth with his gloved hand. The other man was now coming up the stairs, and I knew I couldn't let them find Lily. I bit down hard on his hand, and he yelped, giving me the chance to break free. I ran back to Lily's room and locked the door behind me. They began pounding on the door, shouting angrily. I ran to the window, looked out, and saw a small ledge just outside. We were on the second floor. I opened the window and helped Lily climb out. I followed, and we inched along the ledge toward a nearby tree. We climbed down as fast as we could. Once on the ground, we ran. I didn't know where we were headed, but we needed to get away. We ran to the neighbor's house and banged on the door. Mrs. Thompson answered, her eyes wide with surprise. I quickly explained what was happening, and she let us in. She called the police while I held Lily, trying to calm her down. Though it felt like hours, the police arrived within minutes. They searched the house, but the burglars were gone. They had taken some valuables, but I didn't care. Lily and I were safe, and that was all that mattered. The police took our statements and promised to do everything they could to catch the burglars. I was shaken but grateful we had escaped. We stayed with Mrs. Thompson that night, and I didn't sleep at all, holding Lily close and listening for any sounds outside. The next morning, I went back to the house to see the damage. It was a mess. Drawers pulled out, belongings scattered everywhere. I felt violated knowing strangers had gone through our things. But we were alive, and that was what mattered most. We stayed with friends for a while after that. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the house again. It was a few days later when I first noticed him. I had left work late, around 9 p.m., after finishing some reports. As I walked to my car, I saw a man leaning against a lamppost, his eyes fixed on me. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, but something about his stare made me uneasy. I brushed it off and got into my car, heading home. The next night, he was there again. Same spot, same unsettling stare. This time, I tried to get a better look at him. He was average height, wearing a hoodie that shadowed his face. My heart raced as I hurried to my car. Though I didn't see him again that night, it became a pattern. Every night he was there. I started taking different routes home, hoping to lose him. But no matter which way I went, I always felt his presence. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. One evening, as I was unlocking my door, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing across the street. My blood ran cold. He was getting bolder. I rushed inside and locked all the doors, my hands shaking as I dialed. I called my friend Jason to come over, and he arrived quickly, staying the night. Having him there made me feel a little safer, but I knew this wasn't a permanent solution. The next morning, I found a note on my car windshield with a single word written on it. Soon. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. I went to the police, but they said without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be cautious and to keep a record of any incidents. That night, I installed new locks and bought a baseball bat, just in case. My nerves were on edge. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't sleep. I kept peering out the window, half expecting to see him standing there. A few days later, I decided to work from home, thinking it might make me feel safer. But then, the phone calls started. Every time, the other end was silent, except for the sound of breathing. I knew it was him. Eventually, I stopped answering and let it go to voicemail, but the calls didn't stop. They kept coming, day and night. One evening, I heard a noise from the backyard. Grabbing the bat, I slowly made my way to the back door. Through the window, I saw him trying to open the gate. My heart pounded as I dialed 911. He saw me and took off before the police arrived. They searched the area, but found nothing. The fear was overwhelming. I felt trapped in my own home. I couldn't eat or sleep, consumed by the terror of this unknown man. Determined to protect myself, I bought a security camera and installed it at the front and back of the house. At least now, I could see him coming. One night, I saw him on the camera, lurking in the shadows of my front yard. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked, but it felt like useless advice. The final straw came when I woke up to find my living room window shattered. A brick had been thrown through it, and attached to it was another note. Tonight, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and drove to Jason's place, explaining everything. He insisted I stay with him until this was all sorted out. That night, Jason and I stayed up, watching the security footage from my house. Around midnight, we saw him. He approached the house and tried to open the front door. When he couldn't get in, he moved to the broken window. Jason called the police, and we watched as they finally arrived and caught him. It was a huge relief. The man was arrested and identified as a local with a history of stalking. He had been watching me for weeks, planning God knows what. The police found more notes and disturbing drawings in his apartment. Knowing he was behind bars brought some peace, but the fear lingered. I stayed with Jason for a while, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. It wasn't easy. Every time I walked down the street or heard an unexpected noise, my heart raced. But slowly, I started to feel safer. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment in a different part of town and installed a top-notch security system. The experience left a lasting mark on me. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, I never walked alone at night, and I always checked my rearview mirror. Some time later, I drove up to a farmhouse, dust trailing behind me as the sun set, casting long shadows over the fields. I was meeting a potential buyer named Greg, who had shown interest in the place. The house was old but charming, and I hoped for a quick sale. I parked my car, grabbed my briefcase, and walked toward the front door. When I knocked, the door creaked open on its own. I called out for Greg, but there was no response. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air inside was musty, as if no one had been there for years. I checked my phone for messages but had no service. Deciding to look around, I called out Greg's name again, but got no answer. The living room was empty except for old furniture, covered in dust. I moved to the kitchen, still calling out for Greg, but the silence was unnerving. On the kitchen table, I found a note with my name on it. It simply said, "Hannah, come upstairs." My stomach knotted up, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe Greg was just shy or nervous. I went up the narrow staircase, each step echoing through the house. At the top, I found a hallway with several doors. The note didn't specify which room, so I started with the first one on the left. It was a bedroom, empty and cold. The bed looked like it hadn't been used in years. Backing out, I tried the next room. It was a bathroom, equally neglected. As I moved to the third door, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I opened the door to what appeared to be an office. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the window was open, letting in a slight breeze. On the desk, I found another note. This one simply said, "Basement." I hesitated. This was getting too weird. I decided to leave and call the office once I had service. As I turned to head back downstairs, I heard the front door slam shut. Panic set in. I rushed down the stairs, but when I reached the bottom, I saw a figure standing in front of the door. It was a man, and he definitely didn't look like any buyer I'd ever met. "Who are you?" We called the local police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. They suggested it was probably just an animal. However, by the fifth night, the atmosphere had become tense. We decided to take shifts, keeping watch for any signs of the intruder. At around 3:00 a.m., it was my turn. I sat in the living room, heavy with sleep, when I heard a faint whisper. Turning towards the sound, I saw a figure standing in the hallway, just staring at me. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure stepped forward into the light. It was a man, disheveled and dirty, as if he had been living in the woods for a long time. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. I managed to shout, waking the others who came running. The man bolted, disappearing into the night. We packed our things and left immediately. None of us wanted to stay another minute in that house. On the drive back, we remained silent, each lost in our thoughts. We reported the incident to the rental agency and the police again, but we never discovered who the man was or why he had been living there. That vacation left us all shaken. We realized how vulnerable we were and how quickly a fun getaway could turn into a nightmare. It took a long time for any of us to feel safe again, and we never rented a remote house after that. One day, as I walked to my car in the parking lot, the sun was just starting to set. It had been a long day, and I was ready to go home. As I approached my car, I fumbled through my bag for my keys. I heard footsteps behind me, but didn't think much of it at first. Suddenly, someone grabbed me from behind. I struggled, but they were strong. A hand covered my mouth, and I felt myself being dragged backward. Panic set in. I kicked and tried to scream, but the hand muffled any sound. My heart pounded in my chest. I was shoved into the back of a van, the door slamming shut as the engine roared to life. I couldn't see who had taken me. My hands were tied, and I felt tape being wrapped around my mouth. I tried to scream again, but it was useless. The van drove for what felt like hours, and I couldn't see where we were going. My mind raced with thoughts of all the terrible things that could happen. I knew I had to stay calm and think of a way to escape. Finally, the van stopped. The door opened, and I was roughly pulled out. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees. The man who had taken me wore a mask, his eyes cold and calculating. He dragged me into a small cabin. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled damp. He tied me to a chair and removed the tape from my mouth. I wanted to beg for my life, but my voice wouldn't come out. He just stared at me, not saying a word. I knew I had to do something. I looked around the room, searching for anything that could help me. There was a small window, but it was too high to reach. The man left the room, and I heard a loud click behind him. I struggled against the ropes, but they were tight, and my wrists burned from the effort. I couldn't give up. I had to find a way out. Taking a deep breath, I tried to stay calm and focused. After what felt like hours, the man returned, holding a knife. He walked toward me, and I felt pure terror. He spoke for the first time, telling me that no one was coming to save me. I realized I had to act fast. I begged him to let me go, trying to sound as convincing as possible, telling him my family would pay any ransom he wanted. He laughed and shook his head, saying it wasn't about money. While he was distracted, I managed to loosen the ropes around my wrists just a little. He turned his back to me for a moment, and I saw my chance. I yanked my hands free and grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table. I hit him as hard as I could. He stumbled, and the knife clattered to the floor. I grabbed it and pointed it at him, my hand shaking. He lunged at me, but I managed to slash his arm. He screamed in pain, and I ran for the door, fumbling with the lock. I could hear him behind me, cursing and yelling. I threw the door open and sprinted into the woods, my heart pounding as I didn't look back. Branches scratched my face and arms as I ran, unsure of where I was going but desperate to get away. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, pushing me to keep running. Finally, I saw lights in the distance. It was a road. I ran toward it, waving my arms and shouting for help. A car stopped, and a woman got out, asking what had happened. I told her everything in a rush, and she called the police. They arrived quickly and went into the woods to find him. They told me I was lucky to be alive. They found the cabin, but the man was gone. They assured me they would keep looking until they found him. I spent the next few days in a state of shock, unable to sleep or eat. The police took my statement and started an investigation, believing the man was a serial kidnapper they had been searching for. I stayed with my family, surrounded by people who cared about me. It took a long time to feel safe again. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to appear out of nowhere. Eventually, the police caught him while he was trying to abduct another woman. They said my escape had helped them track him down. I testified in court, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The experience changed me forever. I became more cautious, always aware of my surroundings. Yet, I refused to let fear control my life. I survived because I fought back and didn't give up. Even now, I still have nightmares. But I know I'm strong. I know I can survive anything. That day in the parking lot could have been the end, but it wasn't. While I rented the apartment for the summer, I looked forward to a break from my routine. The place was small but cozy, just right for a few months of peace. The first few weeks were perfect. I spent my days exploring the city and my nights relaxing with a book or a movie. One evening, I noticed something odd. My TV had a slight reflection, and I saw a tiny blinking red light behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I brushed it off as a trick of the light. The next day, I saw the light again, this time from the corner of my living room. I got up and searched around, moving furniture and looking behind shelves, but found nothing. I started to feel uneasy, so I decided to do a thorough check of the apartment. I moved the couch, lifted the carpets, and examined every corner. In the bedroom, I noticed a small hole in the wall just above the wardrobe. Climbing up, I peered inside and discovered a small camera hidden away, its lens staring right at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I pulled the camera out and followed the wire, which led to a tiny hole behind a bookshelf drilled through the wall. I realized there could be more cameras. I checked the bathroom next, and sure enough, there was another one hidden behind the vent. Panic set in. Someone had been watching me. I didn't know for how long or who it was, but I needed to find out. I took the cameras and went to the building manager. He seemed surprised, but I could tell he knew something. He stammered and said he would look into it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump as I kept thinking about who could be watching and why. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to the local electronics store and bought a bug detector. I spent hours sweeping the apartment and found 3 more cameras, all well hidden. I felt violated and exposed. I needed to find out who was doing this. I started to watch the building manager closely. He seemed nervous whenever he saw me, and I noticed he had a routine. He always left the building at the same time every day. One afternoon, I followed him to a nearby cafe, where he met with a man I had never seen before. They talked for a while, and then the man handed him an envelope. My stomach churned. I was getting closer, but I needed proof. I returned to the building and decided to search the manager's office. I waited until he left for the day, then picked the lock and slipped inside. I found a hidden panel behind his desk filled with videotapes and a small monitor. My stomach twisted as I saw tapes labeled with my apartment number and dates going back months. I quickly took the tapes and left. Back in my apartment, I watched a few. The footage showed me in every room, doing everything. Someone had been watching my every move. I called the police and reported what I had found. They arrived quickly and took the evidence. That night, I still couldn't sleep. I felt like I was being watched. The police called me the next day. They had arrested the building manager and his accomplice, who had been running a voyeurism operation, recording tenants and selling the footage online. Even though they were caught, I still felt uneasy. I moved out of the apartment immediately, finding a new place far away and making sure to check every inch for hidden cameras. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, always checking for cameras or anything suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It took a long time to feel safe again. Now, I double-check everything and don't take my privacy for granted. I learned to trust my instincts and act on them. I survived that summer, but it left a mark. I hope I never have to go through something like that again. But I know that if I do, I'll be ready. I'll fight back, and I'll survive, because no one has the right to invade my privacy, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect myself. One day, I took a day off work to run some errands, and decided to stop by the bank to sort out some bills. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal as I walked into the bank. There were a few people ahead of me in line, and I remember thinking how slowly the line was moving. While I was waiting, I noticed a man near the entrance, acting strangely. He kept looking around, almost like he was nervous. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to finish my business and get out of there. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and 3 masked men stormed in. Everyone started screaming and hitting the floor. My heart felt like it was going to explode. One of the robbers fired a shot into the ceiling, and the noise was deafening. Everyone down. One of them shouted. We all dropped to the floor, trembling. The robbers quickly took control, moving around the room and yelling orders. I couldn't believe this was happening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. One of the robbers grabbed the bank manager and forced him to open the vault, while another kept an eye on us, waving his gun around and looking jumpy. I lay there, face down on the cold floor, trying to stay calm. I could hear the robbers shouting at each other, arguing about how much time they had. They sounded scared, which made them even more dangerous. The leader seemed more composed but was ruthless, barking orders and threatening anyone who moved. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was hard. Every little sound made me jump. Glancing around, I saw a woman a few feet away, clutching her child. The kid was crying softly, and I felt a pang of fear for them. One of the robbers, the nervous one, started pacing near us. He kept muttering to himself, and I could see his hand shaking. I knew that if he panicked, things could get a lot worse. I needed to stay calm and not draw attention to myself. I noticed the bank manager stalling, trying to buy time. He opened the vault slowly, talking to the robbers and trying to keep them calm. I realized he was doing his best to protect us, which gave me a little hope, but I knew we were still in serious danger. Then the nervous robber grabbed a woman from the floor and dragged her up. He pointed his gun at her head and yelled at the manager to hurry up. The woman screamed, and everyone else started to cry harder. My heart sank. I felt helpless. I had to do something. I looked around for anything that could help. Near the counter, I saw a phone. If I could reach it, maybe I could call for help. I knew it was risky, but I had to try. I slowly inched my way toward the phone, staying as low as possible. The leader noticed me moving and shouted at me to stop. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He walked over, gun pointed at me, and demanded to know what I was doing. I lied, saying I was just trying to find a more comfortable position. He sneered but seemed to believe me, telling me to stay put before going back to the vault. I was shaken, but I knew I had to try again. I waited for a distraction, anything that would give me another chance. The manager finally got the vault open, and the robbers started loading bags with money. They were so focused on the cash that they didn't notice me inching closer to the phone again. I reached it and quickly dialed 911, whispering for help. I barely finished the call when the nervous robber noticed me. He ran over, furious, and grabbed me by the arm. I thought he was going to shoot me. The leader yelled at him to stay focused, reminding him they didn't have much time. The tension was unbearable, and the robbers were arguing more, getting anxious. I prayed the police would come soon, trying to keep calm and telling myself to stay strong for everyone's sake. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The robbers did too, and they panicked. They grabbed the money and started shouting at each other, trying to decide what to do. The leader told them to take us as hostages. The police arrived and surrounded the building. I could hear them shouting through megaphones, trying to negotiate. The robbers were losing control, and it felt like everything was falling apart. One of the robbers grabbed me and another hostage, dragging us to the front of the bank. They used us as shields, screaming at the police to back off. I was terrified, but I knew I had to stay calm. The police tried to talk the robbers down, promising them safe passage if they let us go. The leader was negotiating, but the nervous robber snapped. He pointed his gun at my head, yelling that he was done waiting. I felt the cold barrel against my temple and thought it was the end. But then, a shot rang out. The police sniper had taken the shot, hitting the nervous robber. He fell, and his gun clattered to the floor. The other robbers panicked and dropped their weapons. The police stormed in, taking them down quickly. I was pulled to safety, my body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't believe it was over. The police took statements and checked on everyone. I was in shock but relieved to be alive. The robbers were arrested, and we were all taken to the hospital to be checked out. I still have nightmares about that day. The fear, the feeling of helplessness. But I'm grateful to be alive, and I know how lucky I am. Our romantic getaway started like a dream. Tom and I rented a remote cabin far away from the city's noise, craving peace and quiet, just the two of us. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, cooked together, and enjoyed the serenity of the woods. On the third night, we were sitting by the fireplace, the only sound being the crackling of the logs. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door. We looked at each other, startled. It was almost midnight, and we weren't expecting anyone. Tom got up to check while I stayed behind, my heart pounding. He peered through the window beside the door and froze. He turned to me, his face pale. "Lisa, there are men outside. They have guns." My stomach dropped, and my mind raced, thinking of what to do. Tom quickly locked the door and turned off the lights. We crouched behind the couch, trying to stay calm. The men outside started shouting, demanding we open the door. They banged on the windows, trying to break in. With no cell service out here, calling for help wasn't an option. We needed to find another way to signal for assistance. I remembered the emergency flare we had brought with us. Tom grabbed the flare gun from the cupboard. We could hear the men getting more aggressive, smashing the windows. A chill ran down my spine as I heard glass shattering. We had to act fast. Tom told me to stay low while he went to the bedroom window to shoot the flare. Just as Tom was about to open the window, one of the men broke through the kitchen window. I screamed, and Tom rushed back to help me. The intruder was inside, pointing his gun at us. Tom and I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The man demanded money and valuables. Tom tried to reason with him, offering what little we had, but it wasn't enough. The man became more aggressive, threatening us. Just then, we heard more glass breaking from another room. The rest of the group was inside the cabin, and our situation was getting worse by the minute. One of the men grabbed me, pulling me away from Tom. I struggled, trying to break free. Tom lunged at him, and they started fighting. The man hit Tom with the butt of his gun, knocking him to the ground. I screamed, fearing for Tom's life. Another man pointed his gun at me, telling me to shut up. In the chaos, I noticed Tom reaching toward the flare gun, which had fallen under the table. I slowly moved towards it, hoping the men wouldn't notice. My hands were shaking, but I managed to grab it. I aimed at the man closest to me and fired. The bright light blinded him, and he dropped his gun. Tom seized the opportunity, tackling the man who had hit him. They struggled on the floor while I grabbed the fallen gun. My hands were trembling, but I pointed it at the other intruders, yelling at them to get out. They hesitated, realizing we were not as helpless as they thought. The man Tom was fighting managed to break free and ran out the door. The others followed, cursing and threatening to come back. We didn't wait to see if they would. Tom and I quickly barricaded the doors and windows with whatever we could find. We knew they might return, so we had to be ready. We spent the rest of the on high alert, watching and listening for any signs of the men coming back. The cabin was eerily quiet, except for our heavy breathing and the occasional crack of the fire. We held each other, trying to stay calm and think of our next move. At dawn, we decided it was too dangerous to stay any longer. We packed our essentials and prepared to leave. We knew the way back to the main road was long and treacherous, but it was our only option. As we stepped outside, the morning sun cast long shadows, making everything look surreal. We moved quickly but cautiously through the woods, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Tom held my hand tightly, assuring me we would make it out of this nightmare. We just needed to keep moving. Hours passed, and we finally reached the main road. We were exhausted, but relieved to see a car approaching. We flighted it down, and the driver, seeing our desperate state, agreed to help us. We told him everything, and he drove us to the nearest town. At the local police station, we recounted our ordeal. The officers took our statements and assured us they would search for the men. They also sent a team to the cabin to investigate. We were still in shock, but knowing the police were involved brought some comfort. The officers arranged for us to stay in a nearby hotel until we could return home safely. That night we barely slept, haunted by the memories of the attack. The reality of what happened was sinking in, and it was hard to process. We were grateful to be alive, but the fear lingered. The next morning we received news that the police had found evidence of the intruders at the cabin, but hadn't caught them yet. We were advised to leave the area and stay somewhere safe. Tom and I packed our bags, ready to put as much distance as possible between us and the nightmare. On the drive back home, we barely spoke. The experience had shaken us deeply, and we knew it would take time to heal. We decided to seek counseling to help us cope with the trauma we needed to support each other and rebuild our sense of security. As the weeks went by, we slowly started to feel more like ourselves. The nightmares became less frequent, and we found comfort in our routines. We stayed in close contact with the police, who eventually caught the intruders, knowing they were behind bars, helped us sleep a little easier. Our romantic getaway had turned into a terrifying ordeal, but we survived. The experience brought us closer, making us realize how much we meant to each other. I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my mind. The stress of work and daily life had been getting to me. I picked a remote spot in the woods far from civilization. The first day was peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and enjoyed the solitude. As night fell, I sat by the campfire listening to the sounds of the forest. It was coming until I heard a faint rustling in the bushes. I dismissed it as an animal and went to bed. The next morning I found footprints around my campsite. They were too big to be from an animal. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was another camper, but I hadn't seen anyone else around. I decided to stay vigilant throughout the day. I explored the area, but tapped close to my camp. As the sun set, I gathered more wood for the fire. The night was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I heard the rustling again, this time closer. I cracked my flashlight and shone it towards the noise. The light caught a glimpse of a figure darting behind a tree. Panic set in. I shouted, asking who was there, but got no response. I stayed up all night watching and listening. By morning I was exhausted. I decided to pack up and leave. As I was dismantling my tent, I noticed something on a nearby tree. It was a small carving, fresh and deliberate. It looked like an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. Ignoring it seemed like the best option. I continued packing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I hurried, wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. As I was about to leave, I found my map missing. I searched frantically, but couldn't find it. Someone had taken it. With no map, I had to rely on memory. I started walking back the way I came, but the dense forest all looked the same. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I felt like I was being herded in a specific direction. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I broke into a run, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in gasps. I stumbled over roots and branches, but I kept going. The footsteps seemed to be giving closer. In my panic, I tripped and fell hard, scraping my knees and hands. As I lay there trying to catch my breath, I saw him, a man rugged and unkempt, standing a few yards away holding my map. He stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. I scrambled to my feet and backed away slowly. He didn't move, just watched me. I turned and ran again, faster than before. I could hear him following, his pace steady and relentless. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I spotted a small cave ahead and darted inside, hoping he wouldn't see me. I crouched in the darkness, trying to quiet my breathing. Minutes felt like hours. As I waited, I heard him walk past the cave, his footsteps fading into the distance. I stayed hidden for a long time, afraid to move. When I finally emerged, the sun was setting. I needed to find my way back before nightfall. I walked cautiously, every sound putting me on edge. I felt like I was being watched again. As darkness fell, I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was shelter. I decided to hide there for the night. Inside, the cabin was musty and filled with cobwebs. I barricaded the door with an old table and sat in a corner, clutching a broken piece of wood as a weapon. The silence was oppressive. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion took over. I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. My heart leaked into my throat as I saw the man standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. He stepped inside slowly, savoring the fear in my eyes. I packed away, but there was nowhere to go. He spoke in a low, gray voice, saying he had been watching me since I arrived. He enjoyed the aunt. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I noticed a small window behind me. It was my only chance. I grabbed a piece of wood and lunged at him, catching him off guard. He staggered back, and I took the opportunity to dive through the window. Clash shattered around me as I hit the CR hard. I didn't look back. I ran with everything I had, my lungs burning, my legs feeling like lead. I could hear him cursing behind me. The forest seemed endless, but I pushed on, driven by sheer terror. I stumbled upon a stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. As dawn broke, I finally saw signs of civilization, a tour road appear ahead, and I ran towards it. I flashed down the first car I saw, a kind elderly couple who immediately took me to the nearest police station. I was shaken and exhausted, but I was safe. The police took my statement and assured me they would search the area. Days later, I found out they hadn't found the man. The thought that he was still out there haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my own home. The solo camping trip that was supposed to bring peace had turned into a nightmare. I never went camping alone again. The fear stayed with me, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing everything. My friend and Sarah and I decided to take a summer vacation in Miami. We were both excited to enjoy the beach and nightlife. On our second night, we went to a popular club. The music was loud and the place was packed. We danced and had a few drinks. It was fun until I lost sight of Sarah. I looked around thinking she might have gone to the bathroom. I texted her, but she didn't reply. I waited a while, but when she didn't come back, I started to worry. I asked people if they had seen her, but no one had. I decided to check outside. I stepped into the night air and looked up and down the street. There was no sign of her. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. I went back into the club and searched every corner, but she wasn't there. I thought about calling the police, but it hadn't been that long since I last saw her. I headed back to our hotel, hoping she might have gone back. When I got there, the room was empty. Her bed was untouched. I couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night staring at the door, hoping she would walk through, but she didn't. The next morning, I went to the police. They took my statement and said they would look into it, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. People go missing in big cities all the time. They said I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to do something. I started retracing our steps from the night before. I went back to the club and asked more people if they had seen her. A bartender remembered her talking to a man, but he didn't know anything else. I checked with other nearby bars and shops, showing them her picture, but no one had seen her. Days went by, and there was no word from Sarah. I felt helpless and scared. I couldn't go back home without her. One evening, I was sitting in a cafe, thinking about what to do next, when I overheard a conversation at the next table. They were talking about girls going missing and how it was connected to a human trafficking ring. My heart raced as I listened. I decided to follow the people talking. When they left the cafe, they led me to a rundown building in a sketchy part of town. I waited outside, trying to gather the courage to go in. Finally, I took a deep breath and walked up to the door. Inside, the place was dark and smelled terrible. I could hear voices coming from a room down the hall. I crept closer and peeped through a crack in the door. There were women inside, some crying, some looking defeated. My stomach turned when I saw Sarah among them. I knew I couldn't take them all on my own. I needed help. I quietly left the building and called the police, telling them what I had seen. They told me to stay put and that they would send someone. I waited, my heart pounding, afraid someone would notice me. It felt like forever before the police arrived. They stormed the building and rescued the women, including Sarah. I ran to her and hugged her tightly. She was shaken and scared, but alive. The police arrested several men involved in the trafficking ring. Sarah told me they had drugged her at the club and taken her while she was unconscious. She didn't remember much, but she was grateful to be free. I stayed by her side as she gave her statement to the police. The whole ordeal felt like a nightmare. We CAO our vacation short and went back home. Sarah needed time to recover, and I needed to process everything that had happened. The police assured us that the ring was being dismantled and that the people responsible would face justice. The experience changed us both. We were more cautious and aware of our surroundings. I couldn't stop thinking about the other women who might still be out there needing help. It haunted me, but I was grateful that we had made it out alive. Sarah and I remained close, our bond strengthened by what we had been through. We knew we were lucky to have found each other in time. The vacation that had started with excitement ended with a terrifying reality that we would never forget. The memories of that night and the days that followed stayed with me. Every time I heard about someone going missing, it brought back the fear and urgency I had felt. I shared our story whenever I could, hoping it would help others stay safe. Life slowly returned to normal, but the shadows of that summer vacation lingered. We couldn't undo what had happened, but we had survived, and that was something to hold on to. I had just moved into a new neighborhood. For the summer, the house was nice, the area quiet, and I was looking forward to a relaxing break. My new neighbor, Mr. Turner, lived next door. I didn't think much of him at first. He was a bit reserved, but that didn't seem unusual. Over the first few days, I noticed some odd things. Mr. Turner was always outside at strange hours. He would walk around his yard in the middle of the night and often had his curtains drawn tightly. I didn't think much of it until I saw him carrying a large duffel bag into his garage one evening. I tried to shrug it off, but my curiosity got the better of me. The garage was mostly hidden from view by tall bushes, so I couldn't see what was inside. I figured I'd keep an eye on things just in case. The more I watched, the more peculiar his behavior became. He had a tendency to offer around the garage, often peeking out and looking around, as if he was checking to see if anyone was watching. One morning, while taking out my trash, I noticed Miss Turner's garage door slightly ajar. I saw a glimpse of something metallic inside. I couldn't resist, so I walked closer, pretending to be busy with my trash. I caught sight of a few hand guns and what looked like ammunition boxes. I was immediately on edge. I knew some people kept weapons, but this felt different. I went inside trying to think logically. My gut was telling me something was wrong. I decided to do a bit more digging. Over the next few days, I watched Miss Turner's routine carefully, noting the times he left and when he came back. One afternoon when he was away, I found a way to get into his garage. I couldn't believe what I saw. There were several crates of weapons and large bundles of what appeared to be maps and documents. I quickly took a few pictures with my phone before I left. As soon as I got back to my house, I went through the photos. The documents had detailed maps and what looked like plans for some sort of operation. It was unsettling. I could see lines marked on the maps and notes that mentioned various places in town. I had no idea what it meant, but it looked sinister. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure where to start. I was scared, but understood that if this was as serious as it seemed, people could be in danger. I decided to call the police, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I kept it fake, saying I was concerned about unusual behavior from my neighbor. The police polly came by, but Mr. Turner was on his best behavior. They didn't find anything out of place and left. I felt helpless. It seemed like I needed more evidence. That night, I noticed Mr. Turner acting even more strange. He seemed agitated and was constantly on the move. The next day, I saw him loading more items into his car. I took a few more pictures from a distance. He drove off, and I decided to investigate further. I went back to his garage and found more documents and some disturbing things that made it clear he was planning something major. I went straight to the police with all my findings. This time I showed them everything. They took me seriously and said they would investigate further. I was anxious and worried. I had waited too long. A few days later, the police returned and told me that they had found EV evidence of illegal activities linked to Mr. Turner. They had been able to link him to some criminal organizations. They also found out that he had been planning something dangerous. They arrested him, and the police told me they were working to ensure the safety of everyone in the neighborhood. The relief I felt was immense. I couldn't believe how close I had come to something truly terrible. The neighborhood felt different after that, quieter and more relaxed. I stayed on high alert for a while, just in case. The summer continued, and though it had started with excitement and promise, It ended up being far more eventful than I had anticipated. I learned a lot about being vigilant and the importance of trusting my instincts. I never had any more trouble from Miss Turner's side of things, and the neighborhood gradually returned to normal. I kept in touch with the police, who assured me that the threat had been contained. Looking back, I am grateful that I acted on my suspicions. It's unsettling to think about what might have happened if I had ignored the signs. I had just finished a long day at the beach with friends and decided to catch a ride back to my hotel. It was late, and I was exhausted. I had no intention of waiting for a taxi, so when a car pulled up and the driver offered a ride, I gratefully accepted. The driver seemed nice enough. He was friendly, and how welcoming. Smile, he asked me about my day and told me he was just driving home. I chatted with him for a bit, feeling comfortable enough to let my guard down. The conversation was light, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. After a few minutes, I noticed that the scenery outside was unfamiliar. We had left the main road and were driving down a dark, secluded street. My instinct started to kick in. I asked the driver if we were going the right way. He assured me that it was a shortcut and that we'd be there soon. I began to feel uneasy. The friendly demeanor of the driver didn't match the creeping sense of dread I was experiencing. I checked my phone to see if I had lost signal or if there was an app that could help me figure out where I was. My phone was almost dead, and I had no way to check. The driver's demeanor started to change. His smile was gone, and he became more distant. I tried to stay calm and maintain the conversation, hoping it would help distract me from my growing fear. I noticed that he wasn't responding much anymore, and that he was driving even further into the darkness. Panic set in when I realized we were on a deserted road far from where I needed to be. I tried to open the car door, but it was locked. I asked the driver to pull over, claiming I needed to make a call. He didn't respond, and the car continued to speed up. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I searched for a way to get out. I remembered seeing movies where people had escaped moving vehicles by jumping out, but I was terrified of the idea. I looked around, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself, or maybe distract him. The driver's focus was solely on the road. I used the opportunity to reach for the door handle, again trying to pry it open. The handle was stiff, but I managed to get it slightly open. My heart raced as I felt the cold air rushing in. The driver glanced at me briefly, but quickly looked back at the road. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and made a split-second decision. I pushed the door open wider, gripping the handle tightly. The wind hit my face, and I braced myself for the worst. With a sudden push, I threw myself out of the car, rolling onto the gravel and dirt of the road. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline kept me going. I scrambled to my feet, looking for cover. The driver slammed on the brakes, and I heard him yelling, but I didn't look back. I ran into the woods next to the road, hoping it would hide me from view. I kept running, my breath coming in like it gasps. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow me up. I was disoriented and scared, but I forced myself to keep moving. I knew I had to find a way to get back to safety. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small house with lights on. I knocked frantically on the door. A middle-aged couple answered, and I explained what had happened. They let me in and called the police for me. I was shaking and exhausted, but relieved to be out of immediate danger. The police arrived soon after and took my statement. They said they would look into it, but they couldn't guarantee they would catch the driver. I was shaken up but grateful to be safe. The couple offered to let me stay the night, which I gladly accepted. The next morning, I was able to get a ride back to my hotel. The whole experience left me rattled. I realized how quickly things could turn dangerous and how important it is to stay alert. I made sure to take extra precautions in the future, always double-checking who I was getting into a car with and being more aware of my surroundings. The summer continued, but I never forgot that night. It all started when I decided to run away from home. I was 16, and everything felt overwhelming. My parents were always fighting, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I packed a small bag with some clothes and a few personal items, then left early. One morning, while they were still asleep, I made my way to the train station, my heart pounding the whole way. I planned to catch a train to a nearby city where I thought I could figure things out. The train station was crowded, and I felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. I was free, or at least I thought I was. That's when I met him. He seemed friendly, maybe in his late 20s, with a warm smile and kind eyes. He was sitting on the bench next to where I was waiting, and he struck up a conversation. He asked where I was headed, and if I needed any help. I was wary at first, but decided to trust him. I was young and scared, and he seemed genuine. We talked for a while, and he told me his name was Mike. He said he was going to the same city and offered to share his training. Took it with me. I hesitated, but accepted. He seemed like someone who genuinely wanted to help, and I was too overwhelmed to think clearly. When the train arrived, he led me to the correct platform. Everything seemed fine, and I felt a little better. We got on the train together and found a seat. The journey was long, and we talked about everything. My plans, my hopes, and my fears. He listened attentively and offered supportive advice. After a while, I started to notice that his behavior was a bit odd. He would occasionally glance around the train car, as if he was checking something. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe he was just nervous about the journey, just like I was. Halfway through the trip, Mike suggested we go to the dining car for a drink. I was thirsty and agreed. We walked down the narrow corridor together. It was quieter there, and I started to feel uneasy. Mike seemed more focused and intense in the dining car. He ordered a drink and offered me one too. I wasn't really hungry or thirsty, but I took it anyway. I noticed that he was watching me closely. His demeanor had changed from friendly to something more unsettling. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were on edge. After we turned to our seats, he became even more distant and started asking more personal questions. It felt invasive. I began to regret accepting his help and wished I hadn't trusted him so easily. When the train approached the next station, Mike's behavior escalated. He leaned in close and whispered that he had an important message for me. I was confused and anxious. He said he had arranged a place for me to stay and that it would be safer for me. I came with him. When we got off the train, my heart raced. The train pulled into the station, and Mike stood up quickly, almost too quickly. He looked around nervously. I knew something was wrong. As we stepped off the train, he guided me toward a less populated area of the station. My instinct screamed me to get away. I made an excuse to go to the restroom and hurried off in the opposite direction. I kept my head down and walked briskly, trying to blend in with the crowd. I could feel Mike's eyes on me, and I was sure he was looking for me in the restroom. I tried to calm myself and think I knew I had to get away from him. I peeked out and saw him still searching. My heart was pounding. I decided to use the public phone to call the police. I told them everything and gave them a description of Mike and the train details. The police arrived quickly. They searched the station and found Mike still looking for me. They spoke with him and then came to check on me. They said they would take care of him and ensure I was safe. I was shaken and exhausted, but relieved. They gave me a ride to a safe location and helped me contact my parents. It was hard to explain everything to them, but they were just grateful I was safe. That day was a harsh letter in trust and caution. I learned that not everyone who offers help has good intentions. It took time to recover from the fear and anxiety, but I was grateful for the police and for the chance to go home safely. I had always loved the outdoors, so I decided to start a business leading wilderness survival trips. This summer, I had a group of 8 tourists signed up for a week-long adventure in the remote woods. We were all set to spend a week hiking, camping, and learning survival skills. It was supposed to be an enriching experience for everyone. The first day went smoothly. The group was enthusiastic, and everyone was getting along well. We set up camp by a small clearing, and I went over the basics of fire making and shelter building. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, and I felt a sense of satisfaction seeing them excited to learn. On the second day, one of the tourists caught my attention. His name was Mark. He was very quiet and kept to himself. I noticed he seemed more interested in observing us than participating at first. I thought he was just shy, but his behavior started to unsettle me. As the days went by, Mark began to show up at odd times. He would disappear into the woods alone and return with strange items he wouldn't explain when asked about it. He would brush off the questions with fake answers. His eyes had a coldness to them that I couldn't ignore. I started to worry, but I didn't want to alarm the other tourists. On the fourth day, things took a darker turn. While we were practicing tracking and foraging, Mark disappeared for a long period. When he finally returned, he looked disheveled and had blood on his clothes. I asked him if he was okay, and he claimed it was from a small animal he accidentally injured. I wasn't convinced, but I let it go, thinking it was just my paranoia. That night, while everyone was sleeping, I heard noises outside the tent. I unzipped quietly and peeked out. I saw Mark walking around the perimeter of the camp with a flashlight, scanning the area in a methodical way. He wasn't looking for something, he was searching for something specific. The next morning, I confronted him about his behavior. He laughed it off and said he was just checking for wild animals. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We continued with the trip, but the tension was palpable. Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would stare at the others with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. I could sense that the group was starting to pick up on the unease, and I needed to keep everyone calm and focused. By the sixth day, we decided to go for a longer hike, hoping it would distract us from the growing discomfort. Mark was supposed to stay at camp, but he insisted on coming along. I hesitated but allowed him to join us, worried that confronting him might escalate things during the hike. We stopped for lunch by a stream. Mark wandered off again, and I was growing increasingly concerned. I gathered everyone to make sure we stayed together and safe. As we ate, I noticed that Mark had a strange bulge under his jacket. When he went to the bathroom, I saw him placing something in his backpack, something metallic. After lunch, I decided to follow Mark discreetly. I trailed him through the woods, keeping out of sight. He eventually stopped at a secluded spot and took out what looked like a hunting knife and a rope. My heart sank as I realized he was preparing something sinister. It was becoming clear that he wasn't just a strange tourist, he was a threat. I knew I had to act quickly. I returned to the group and tried to keep my composure. I told them that we needed to head back to camp immediately and packed up our things as fast as possible. I didn't want to panic anyone, but I made sure to keep Mark in sight. When we got back to camp, I told everyone we were going to pack up and leave early. Due to unexpected changes in weather conditions, I started gathering area, trying to appear as calm as possible. Mark watched with a strange interest but said nothing. As we were packing, I noticed Mark trying to sneak away with his backpack. I confronted him and asked him where he was going. He claimed he was just going to get some fresh air, but his eyes betrayed his intentions. I decided to call for help, but our cell service was spotty. I used a satellite phone to contact local authorities and explain the situation. They advised me to keep Mark in sight and to stay with the group until Al arrived. With a growing sense of dread, I kept everyone together and made sure we stayed in a safe area. Mark became increasingly agitated as the hours passed. He started making erratic movements and talking to himself. I could tell he was losing control. Finally, our rescue team arrived. They found Mark trying to sneak away from the camp. They took him into custody and assured us that we were safe. It was a relief, but I was still shaken. I didn't realize how close we had come to a terrible situation. The authorities later confirmed that Mark had been using the trip as a cover for hunting people. He had a history of violent behavior, and his plans were much more sinister than I had imagined. I felt a mix of relief and guilt knowing that the trip had almost ended in disaster. The rest of the trip was subdued. We returned home, and everyone was safe. I made sure to follow up with the tourists to ensure they were okay. I was driving home from a weekend getaway, feeling relaxed after spending a few days out of town. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadow was over the highway. The road was empty, and I was looking forward to getting home And unwinding as I was driving, I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. With its hazard lights flashing, a man was standing next to it. Looking around anxiously, he was waving his arms and seemed desperate for help. I was in a good mood and decided to stop and see if he needed assistance. When I pulled over, the man approached my truck. He looked relieved to see me and started explaining that his car had broken down and that he had no self-service to call for help. His story seemed plausible, and I offered to call a tow truck for him. He thanked me and said he would really appreciate it if I could just give him a ride to the nearest service station. He said it was only a few miles up the road and that he would arrange for a tow from there. I agreed, and he got into my truck. He seemed nervous, but friendly enough. As we drove, the man started asking me about my plans and what I was doing up there. I answered his questions, but his behavior seemed increasingly odd. He would glance nervously out the window and seemed uncomfortable. I tried to stay positive and make small talk, but it was clear he was preoccupied. We were about halfway to the service station when he suddenly asked me to pull over. He said he had forgotten something in his car and needed to kick it. Quickly, I was confused, but stopped the truck. He got out and went back to his broken-down car. I watched him through the rearview mirror. As I waited, I noticed more movement around his car. At first, I thought it was just the wind or shadows playing tricks, but then I saw other people approaching from the trees. They were dressed in dark clothing and seemed to be carrying something. My heart started racing as I realized the situation might not be as it seemed. The man returned to my truck, but now he had a different look on his face. He was no longer anxious, but rather had a cold, calculating look. I started to get a bad feeling, and when he got back in the truck, he told me to keep driving. His tone had changed, and it was clear he was no longer interested in a friendly conversation. Before I could react, the people from the trees started moving towards my truck. I could see they were carrying crowbars and other tools. Panic set in, and I realized I was in serious trouble. The man next to me quickly turned to face me, pulling out a knife. He demanded a hand over my keys and wallet. I tried to stay calm and think quickly. I knew I had to act fast. I pretended to comply, handing over my keys and wallet while my mind raced to find an escape plan. The thieves were closing in, and I could see their determined expressions. Just as one of them reached the truck, I made a split-second decision. I crapped the gear shift and slammed into reverse. The truck lurched backward, and the thief stumbled out of the way. I could hear shouting and yelling as the others scrambled to react. I managed to reverse the truck back onto the road and then sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the mirror and saw the thieves running after me, but they quickly gave up as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest police station, where I reported the attempted robbery. The police took my statement and sent officers to the scene. They found the abandoned car and some of the thieves' belongings, but didn't manage to catch them. I was shaken but relieved to be safe. The experience left me worried and more cautious about stopping to help strangers in the future. It was a tough lesson learned, but I was grateful for my quick thinking and the fact that I managed to escape unharmed. I had decided to go for a jog in the park one evening. The weather was perfect, and I wanted to clear my mind. After a long day, the park was pretty big, with lots of winding paths and trees. It was my favorite place to run because it felt peaceful and safe. I started off on my usual route, listening to my music and enjoying the fresh air. There were a few other joggers and people walking their dogs, but it wasn't too crowded. I felt good pushing myself to run a bit faster than usual. After about 15 minutes, I noticed someone behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often ran in the park, but something felt off. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man jogging at a steady pace not too far behind me. He looked ordinary, but there was something about the way he was watching me that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and kept running. Maybe he was just going the same way, but as I took a few more turns, he stayed right back behind me. My heart started to race, not from the running but from fear. I decided to test my suspicion and took an unusual route, one I didn't normally use. He followed, panic set in. I needed to lose him. I picked up my pace, hoping to outrun him. But he matched my speed. My mind was racing. What did he want? Why was he following me? I couldn't think straight. Just focused on getting away. I spotted a fork in the path up ahead. I knew one way led deeper into the park, more secluded, while the other led to the main road. I took the path to the main road, hoping to find more people and possibly some help, but he was still there, getting closer. I could hear his footsteps behind me getting louder. My breathing was heavy, and my legs were starting to burn. I needed a plan. Up ahead, I saw a small wooded area. If I could hide there, maybe he passed by without noticing. I darted off the path and into the trees, crouching down behind some bushes. I tried to control my breathing, listening for his footsteps. They slowed down, and I heard him walking, looking around. I prayed he wouldn't find me. He stopped right near where I was hiding. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I could see his showed through the leaves. He stood there for what felt like forever, then finally moved on. I waited a few more minutes, making sure he was gone. Slowly, I crept out of my hiding spot and looked around. The path was clear. I needed to get out of the park and find help. I started jump knocking again, but cautiously, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I didn't see him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere. I reached the main road and felt a wave of relief. There were more people around. I felt safer. I saw a group of joggers and decided to stick close to them. I kept running until I reached a convenience store near the park entrance. I went inside and told the cashier what had happened. He let me use the phone to call a friend to come pick me up. While I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Why had he followed me? What would have happened if he had caught me? My friend arrived, and I felt a sense of safety wash over me. As I got into the car, I told her everything on the way home. She was as scared as I was and suggested we reported to the police. I agreed, and we went to the station to file a report. The police took my statement and said they would keep an eye on the park. I didn't know if they would find him, but I felt better knowing they were aware of what happened. It took me a long time to calm down that night, and even longer to feel safe enough to go jogging again. For weeks I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stopped running in the park and joined a gym. Instead, every time I saw someone who looked remotely like him, my heart would race, and I'd feel that same panic. It's been a few months now, and I'm slowly starting to feel normal again. It was a warm summer night when I got the call. I was sitting on my porch enjoying the quiet when my phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic, saying there had been an emergency at the school where I taught. They said I needed to come immediately. I didn't recognize the voice, but in my rush, I didn't question it. I grabbed my keys and drove to the school. The streets were empty, and as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed there were no other cars. It struck me as odd, but I was too worried to think much of it. I got out of my car and headed to the main entrance. The doors were unlocked, which was unusual for this time of night. I stepped inside and called out, but there was no answer. The halls were dimly lit, and my footsteps echoed as I walked through the building. I checked the classrooms one by one, but they were all empty. My heart started to race as I realized something wasn't right. I decided to head to the office to see if anyone was there. As I walked, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. I reached the office and found it dark and deserted. Panic set in. I tried to call the number that had contacted me, but there was no answer. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was alone, and it was clear that something was very wrong. I decided to leave and call the police. As I turned to head back down the hall, I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart pounding. The shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm. The silence was oppressive, and every creak and groan of the building made me jump. I was almost at the door when I heard a soft voice behind me whispering my name. I spun around, but again there was no one there. Fear seized me, and I started to run. As I reached the main doors, I found them locked. I pulled and pushed, but they wouldn't budge. My breath came in short gasps as I looked around for another way out. I decided to head to the gym. There was a back door there that led outside. As I made my way through the hallways, I heard footsteps again, this time closer and more deliberate. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. When I reached the gym, I found the door slightly ajar. Relief washed over me as I pushed it open and stepped outside. The cool night air hit my face, but my relief was short-lived. I heard the footsteps again, now right behind me. I ran across the field towards my car, fumbling with my keys. I could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer. I reached my car and threw myself inside, locking the doors. Just as a figure appeared in the darkness, I couldn't make up their face, but they stood there watching me. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing there, illuminated by the headlights. I drove straight to the police station and told them everything. They took my statement and sent officers to the school, but they didn't find anyone. The call had been made from a disposable phone, and there were no leads for weeks after that night. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I was alone, I felt like someone was there, lurking in the shadows. I changed my routine, always looking over my shoulder. Eventually the fear started to fade, but I never felt completely safe again. I still don't know who called me that night or what they wanted, but I do know that they had planned to trap me. I am grateful I managed to get away, but the experience has left me on edge. I woke up to a heavy feeling in my head, like I hadn't slept at all. My mouth was dry, and my eyes felt gritty. I tried to sit up, but something felt off. I rubbed my eyes and looked around the small motel room. The clock on the nightstand read 2:37. I remember checking in late, exhausted from the drive. I just wanted to sleep. I stood up and walked to the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, thinking it was stuck, but it didn't move. I realized then that it was locked from the outside. My heart began to race. Why would anyone lock me? And I checked the windows. Next, they were nailed shut. Panic set in. I felt trapped like a caged animal. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. The walls were thin. I remembered hearing the TV from the next room earlier. Surely someone would hear me. Minutes felt like hours. I kept banging and shouting, but there was no response. I looked around the room for something to use, something to break the door or windows. There was a small chair and a bedside lamp, but they seemed useless. I decided to try my phone. Maybe I could call for help. I searched for it, but it was nowhere to be found. I clearly remembered leaving it on the nightstand. My mind raced with thoughts. Did someone take it while I was asleep? Who would do this? Suddenly I heard a noise outside the door. It was faint, like someone trying to be quiet. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear. There was a shuffling sound, and then in silence my breath caught in my throat. Someone was out there. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed a plan. I grabbed the chair and placed it under the doorknob, hoping it might slow them down if they tried to come in. I took the lamp and smashed it on the floor, picking up a shard of glass for protection. The room was eerily silent. Every creak and grow of the old building seemed amplified. I sat on the bed, gripping the glass shard tightly, my eyes fixed on the door. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then the doorknob rattled. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The chair under the knob shook as whoever was outside tried to open the door. They pushed harder and the door creaked but didn't open. The rattling stopped, and there was a low, frustrated crawl. I heard footsteps moving away from the door. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath, but the relief was short-lived. I knew they would come back. I had to find a way out, and fast. I examined the room again. The bathroom door was open, and I remembered there was a small window above the shower. It was my only chance. I ran to the bathroom and climbed into the tub. The window was tiny, but I thought I could squeeze through. I pushed at the window, but it was stuck. I used a shard of glass to pry at the edges, and finally it gave way. I pulled myself up and walled through the opening. The glass scraped my arms, but I didn't tear. I just needed to get out. I fell to the ground outside with a thud. The impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath. The night air was cool against my skin, and I felt a moment of relief. But I knew I wasn't safe yet. I got up and ran, not looking back. The motel was isolated, surrounded by trees. In darkness, I didn't know where I was going, but I had to put as much distance as possible between me and the motel. I stumbled through the woods, branches scratching my face and arms. My heart pounded in my ears, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt like I was being hunted. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance, a road. I ran towards it, waving my arms. Frantically, a car slowed down and stopped. The driver rolled down the window, a concerned look on his face. I quickly explained my situation, and he let me in. We drove to the nearest town, and I called the police. They went to the motel, but there was no sign of the person who had locked me and my belongings, including my phone, were gone. I still don't know who did it or why. The power went out at around 900 p.m. I had just finished making dinner and was about to sit down with a book when everything went dark. The whole city was out. I could see nothing but pitch black from my apartment window. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight, and my heart pounded a bit faster than usual. There was something unnerving about the sudden loss of light. I found a few candles in a drawer and lit them. Their flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, making the room look eerie. I sat on the couch trying to relax. The quiet was unnerving. Usually there were sounds from the street, people, cars, but now it was silent. A faint sound caught my attention. It was a creak, like a floorboard shifting. I told myself it was just a building settling, but it sounded too close. I stood up, holding my phone out in front of me. The light barely pierced the darkness, but it was better than nothing. I moved slowly towards the sound, trying to be as quiet as possible. The candles flickered as I passed, and the shadows seemed to dance around me. My heart was racing, and my mind kept imagining the worst. As I reached the hallway, I heard another noise. This time, it was a soft thought, like something falling onto the carpet. I froze, straining my ears to hear better. There was nothing for a moment, and then a shuffle, like someone moving quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't alone. Someone was in my apartment. I packed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. I needed a weapon, something to defend myself. I headed to the kitchen, where I kept a few knives. As I grabbed a knife from the drawer, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of my bedroom. My breath caught in my throat. I needed to stay calm, but panic was rising inside me. I moved to the living room and hid behind the couch. The footsteps grew closer, and I could see a faint light moving down the hallway. It wasn't the flickering light of a candle. It was steady, like a flashlight. My hands were shaking, gripping the knife tightly. The light swept into the living room, illuminating the furniture and the walls. I could hear my own heartbeat loud and fast. The intruder was close. I hid my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible behind the couch. The footsteps stopped, and the light paused in the center of the room. I could see the shadow of the intruder on the wall. They were tall and moved with a sense of purpose. I felt a surge of fear. I had to get out of here. I slowly crawled towards the back door, keeping low to the ground. The intruder's light moved again, sweeping across the room. I reached the door and tried to open it as quietly as possible. The hinges creaked, and I froze. The light turned towards me, and I knew I had been spotted. I bolted, running out into the hallway. The intruder was right behind me, their footsteps pounding on the floor. I ran down the stairs, my knife still in hand. The building was completely dark, and I stumbled several times, almost falling. I reached the ground floor and burst out the front door. The street was just as dark as my apartment, but at least I was outside. I kept running, not daring to look back. I could hear the intruder behind me, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. I turned a corner and hid behind a dumpster, trying to catch my breath. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat running down my back. I listened, but I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. Maybe I had lost them. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, afraid to move. The city was still dark, and the silence was almost oppressive. Finally, I peeked out from behind the dumpster. The street was empty. There was no sign of the intruder. I slowly made my way back to my apartment, keeping to the shadows. When I reached my building, I looked around carefully before entering. I took the stairs back up to my floor, my knife still in hand. The door to my apartment was open, and I could see the faint glow of my candles. Inside, I stepped in cautiously, ready for anything, but the intruder was gone. I closed the door behind me and locked it. My hands still shaking, I called the police and they arrived. Quickly, they searched the apartment, but found no one. The officer said it was likely someone taking advantage of the blackout to break in, but that didn't make me feel any better. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the knife and listening to every sound. The candles burned low, casting their eerie light. The power came back on around 3:00 a.m., but I still felt the chill in the air. I knew I would never feel safe in my apartment again. We were all gathered at the beach, celebrating the end of summer. The sky was clear, the waves gently lapping at the shore, and the bonfire crackled warmly as we laughed and shared stories. Matt, our host, had done a great job organizing the party. There were about 20 of us enjoying the night with music, drinks, and good company. As the evening went on, a group of people approached our area. At first, we thought they were just more partygoers, but something felt off. There were 6 of them, and they didn't look like they were there to have fun. They walked straight into our circle, not saying anything, just looking around with hard expressions. Matt went up to them, trying to be polite. "Hey guys, this is a private party. Can we help you with something?" One of the men, tall and muscular, with a shaved head, stepped forward and smirked. "We're just here to join the fun," he said, his tone menacing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The tension was palpable. The strangers didn't wait for an invitation. They grabbed drinks and made themselves comfortable. Matt tried to defuse the situation, offering them food and trying to keep the peace, but it was clear these guys were looking for trouble. Things escalated quickly. One of them shoved Matt, and he stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. "Hey, there's no need for that," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. The guy who pushed him laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. Before we knew it, they started picking fights, pushing people around and smashing our stuff. One of them grabbed a girl named Lisa, pulling her close and making crude comments. She screamed, and her boyfriend tried to intervene, only to be punched hard in the face. Panic spread through the group. Some tried to run, but the intruders blocked their way. Matt's friend Jake managed to slip away unnoticed, and I hated he was going to get help. I stayed close to the bonfire, my heart racing, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. The guy with the shaved head spotted me. He cried, a predatory look in his eyes, and started walking towards me. I backed away, slowly trying to keep the fire between us. He picked up a bottle and smashed it against a rock, brandishing the jagged edge like a weapon. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low and threatening. I glanced around, desperate for a way out. My friends were either being held or trying to hide. The party atmosphere completely shattered out of the corner of my eye. I saw Matt grab a piece of driftwood. He swung it at one of the attackers, knocking him to the ground. That moment of chaos gave me a chance. I grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire and held it out in front of me. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. The man with the shaved head paused, eyeing the flaming torch wearily. "You're going to regret this," he snarled, but he didn't move closer. Suddenly, there were shouts from the edge of the beach. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and I saw a group of people running towards us. Jake had found help. The intruders hesitated, and then, realizing they were outnumbered, they started to back off. "Let's get out of here," one of them yelled. They ran off into the night, leaving a shaken but alive the newcomer, a mix of locals and some off-duty police officers Jake had found, helped us calm down and make sure everyone was okay. We gathered around the bonfire, trying to make sense of what just happened. The police were called, and we gave our statements describing the attackers as best we could. Matt sat next to me, his face bruised but his eyes determined. We got through it. he said, his voice steady despite everything. We're safe now. The rest of the night was a blur of police lights and worried conversations. We packed up our things and left the beach, sticking together until we all made it home. I was walking home from a late shift at the diner. It was a summer evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. I had been working all day and was tired. I wanted to get home quickly, so I decided to take a shortcut through an alley that I usually avoided after dark. The alley was poorly lit, with only a few dim street lights casting weak shadows on the cracked pavement. As I walked, I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. The alley was narrow, and the buildings on either side rolled and seemed to close in on me. I could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. About halfway through, I noticed a group of men standing near the far end of the alley. They were talking amongst themselves and seemed to be paying more attention to each other than to me. I hoped they would not notice me, but as I approached, I could see them glance in my direction. One of the men broke away from the group and started walking towards me. He looked rough and had a sneer on his face. I quickened my pace, hoping to pass by them without incident. Just as I was almost past, the man stepped in front of me and blocked my way. He was tall and built, and there was something intimidating about him. "Hey there," he said in a gruff voice. "Where are you headed?" I tried to stay calm and polite. "Just on my way home. I'm in a hurry." The man smirked and called over his friends. They began to surround me, closing off any chance of escape. My heart started to race. I knew I had to think quickly. They didn't seem to have good intentions, and their expressions grew more menacing as they gathered around. One of the men reached into his jacket, and I noticed a glint of metal. I couldn't tell if it was a weapon, but it made me even more anxious. I decided to act fast. I needed to create a distraction or find a way to get out of this situation. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to sound as sincere as possible. "I just need to get home. Can you please let me pass?" The man who had initially blocked me seemed to be the leader. He crossed his arms and shook his head. "You think you can just walk away? We have other plans." My mind as I searched for a way out, I spotted a fire escape ladder attached to one of the buildings. It was rusty, but looked like it might be usable. I had to get their attention away from me and make a break for it. In a split-second decision, I took a deep breath and shouted, "Hey, what's that over there?" I pointed toward a dumpster at the other end of the alley. The men turned their heads, and I seized a moment. I started toward the fire escape ladder, grabbing hold of it and climbing as fast as I could. I could hear the men yelling behind me, but I didn't stop. My heart pounded as I scrambled up the ladder. When I reached the top, I could see the rooftops of the buildings around me. I needed to find a way down. Quickly, I noticed a skylight on the roof and hoped it led to a building with an exit. I pried the skylight open and climbed through, landing inside a dark room. I took a moment to catch my breath and listen. I could hear muffled voices and footsteps outside, but they seemed to be moving away. I wasn't safe yet, but I had bought myself some time. I carefully made my way through the building, finding a stairwell and heading down to the ground floor. As I reached the street, I looked around to make sure no one was following me. The alley was now quiet, and the men seemed to have left. I walked briskly to the nearest public place, a 24-hour convenience store. I went inside and asked to use their phone to call for a tab. I was shaken, but I managed to get home safely. Once I was back, I reported the incident to the police. They took my statement and said they would look into it. I never heard anything more about it, but I made sure to avoid that alley in the future. I was home alone with my 2-year-old son. Liam, my husband, had left for a business trip that morning, and it was just the two of us for the weekend. The day had gone smoothly. I fed Liam, played with him, and put him down for his nap. After he woke up, we had dinner, and then I put into bed. The house was quiet, except for the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling for the night. It was around 900 pounds when I first heard the noise. It was a faint sound, like something being dragged across the floor. coming from the basement. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination, but the noise came again. Louder this time. My heart started to race. I decided to check it out, hoping it was nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the basement door. As I opened it, the creaking sound seemed to echo throughout the house. I stood at the top of the stairs, shining the flashlight down into the darkness. Everything looked normal, but the unsettling feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I slowly descended the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. While I reached the bottom, I scanned the room with a flashlight. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and tools. I didn't see anything out of place. I started to convince myself that it was just unsettling when I heard a soft thud behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight being trembling in my hand. Standing at the far end of the basement was a man. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face partially covered by a hood. He stared at me, not moving. My blood ran cold. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I backed up slowly, my mind racing. My first thought was of Liam, upstairs asleep in his crib. The man took a step towards me. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I locked it and grabbed my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. I told the operator about the intruder, and they said officers were on their way. I ran to Liam's room, scooping him up from his crib. He stirred and whimpered, but didn't wake up fully. I clutched him to my chest, trying to think of what to do next. I could hear the man banging on the basement door, trying to break it down. My heart pounded in my ears. I went into the bathroom, locking the door behind us. I set Liam down in the bathtub, wrapping him in a blanket to keep him quiet and safe. I grabbed a heavy object, a metal towel rack, to defend myself if necessary. The banging on the basement door stopped. I listened intently, trying to hear any movement. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. He had found another way, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find. The footsteps grew closer, and I could see his shadow under the bathroom door. He tried the doorknob, and when it didn't budge, he started pounding on the door. I whispered to Liam, telling him to stay quiet. The door began to splinter under the force of his blows. I raised the towel rack, ready to defend my son. The door burst open, and the man stepped in. He looked around, spotting us in the bathtub. He smiled a cruel, menacing grin just as he took a step towards us. I swung the towel rack with all my might. It hit him in the side of the head, and he stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed Liam and ran past him, down the hallway and out the front door. I could hear him yelling behind us, but I didn't look back. We made it to the front yard just as the police arrived. They stormed into the house, and I collapsed on the grass, clutching Liam tightly. He was crying now, and I tried to comfort him, my own tears streaming down my face. The officers quickly subdued the intruder and took him away in handcuffs. An officer stayed with us, while others searched the house to make sure it was safe. I couldn't stop shaking even when they assured me that the man was in custody. I held Liam close, grateful that we were both safe. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, one that I would never forget. I need to share what happened during our family vacation. It started off as a regular trip to a remote town we had rented for the summer. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. We arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods. The place was charming with its rustic look, and the view of the lake was beautiful. My wife, Sarah, and our two kids, Lily and Jake, were excited. We unloaded the car and settled. In the first couple of days were great. We hiked, fished, and spent evenings by the campfire. Everything seemed perfect until I noticed something odd. It was on the third night I had gone out to check the grill because the kids wanted to roast marshmallows. As I walked around the cabin, I saw something unusual. There was a small dark spot on one of the trees close to the cabin. It looked like someone had scratched the bark. I thought nothing of it. I assumed it was just a stray mark from a previous renter, or perhaps an animal. Later that night I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling sound. I went outside with a flashlight, but found nothing. I shredded it off as the wind, or an animal. I didn't mention it to Sarah. I didn't want to worry her. The next morning I saw more marks on the trees. They were fresh, and the scratches seemed to be forming a pattern almost like an arrow pointing towards the cabin. This unsettled me, but I didn't want to alarm my family. I decided to keep an eye on things that night while everyone was asleep. I heard the sound again this time. It was closer. I crapped the flashlight and went outside. I looked around the cabin and noticed something in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. My heart raced, but I couldn't see clearly enough to make out who it was. I went back inside and locked all the doors and windows. I decided to wait and see if anything else happened. I felt like someone was watching us. The following day I found more signs of disturbance. It looked like someone had been near the cabin during the night. I told Sarah about my concerns. She was worried, but thought it was just my imagination. I couldn't blame her for thinking that. I tried to stay calm for the sake of the kids. We decided to go for a hike to distract ourselves. During the hike, I noticed a man watching us from a distance. He was dressed in dark clothes and appeared to be hiding behind some trees. I pointed him out to Sarah, but by the time we got closer, he was gone. Sarah thought it might be a fellow hiker, but wasn't convinced. That night I heard footsteps around the cabin. They were slow and deliberate. I woke Sarah and told her to stay quiet. I took a peek outside and saw the same figure again, closer to the cabin. This time I was terrified and didn't know what to do. The next morning I found that someone had tampered with the cabin's porch lights. The bulbs were unscrewed. This made me even more anxious. I decided we should leave immediately, but Sarah insisted on staying one more night since we had already paid for the week. That night the situation escalated. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were louder and more aggressive. I saw the figure clearly through a gap in the curtains. It was a man with a rough face, wearing a mask. I couldn't take any chances. I woke Sarah and told her we had to leave. We packed as quickly as possible. As we were loading the car, I saw the man emerging from the woods. He was carrying what looked like a crowbar. I told Sarah to get the kids in the car while I tried to confront the man. I grabbed a baseball bat from the trunk. As I approached the man, he ran back into the woods. I didn't pursue him, but made sure everyone was safe inside the car. We drove straight to the nearest town and stayed in a motel for the night. The next day I reported the incident to the local police. They took our statement and said they would look into it, but they couldn't offer much help since there was no clear evidence of the man's identity. The police never found out who the man was, but we were able to get a refund for the remaining days at the cabin. We went home early and never returned to that cabin. The experience left us all shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I still get anxious when we go on vacation, always checking and double-checking our accommodations. The memory of that summer and the feeling of being watched will always haunt me. I was working the night shift at the gas station. It was a quiet night, the kind I liked. Only a few customers had come in, and I was mostly just keeping myself busy stocking shelves and cleaning up. The age of the fluorescent lights and the occasional buzz from the refrigerator were the only sounds in the store. It was almost midnight, and I was looking forward to the end of my shift. I was behind the counter when I saw two men walk in. They looked normal enough at first, just customers coming in late, but something about them made me uneasy. They were both wearing dark clothes, and one of them had a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The other had each up. They didn't head for the aisles. They came straight toward the counter. Before I could react, the man in the cap pulled out a gun. He pointed it right at me and told me to be quiet and do exactly what he said. My heart started ringing, and I could feel sweat on my forehead. I nodded, trying to stay calm. The other man went to the door and flipped the sign to close, then locked it. We were trapped. The man with the gun told me to empty the register into a bag. My hands were shaking so much it was hard to do. I kept glancing at the gun, afraid he might shoot if I moved too slow. I finally got the money into the bag and handed it to him. He snatched it away and told me to get down on the floor. I did as he said, lying face down. Behind the counter, I could hear them talking in low voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I thought about pressing the silent alarm under the counter, but I was too scared they would see me. The one with the came over and started tying my hands behind my back with zip ties. He did the same to my feet. They left me there and started going through the store, grabbing things off the shelves and stuffing them into bags. I could hear them laughing and joking like this was just another night for them. I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I was going to survive this. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they dragged me out from behind the counter. They sat me in one of the chairs by the window where customers usually sat to eat their snacks and drink their coffee. The one with the gun sat across from me, still pointing it at me. The other one kept rifling through the store. I kept thinking about the silent alarm. If I could just get to it, the police would come. But every time I shifted in my seat, the man with the gun would tell me to stay still. He looked nervous, his eyes sitting around the store. I knew that nervousness could make him dangerous. So suddenly there was a knock on the door. A young couple was outside, looking confused by the closed sign. The man with the gun cursed under his breath and motioned for me to stay quiet. The other man went to the door and told the couple the store was closed for the night. They looked disappointed but didn't argue and walked away. The distraction gave me an idea. I told the man with the gun that I needed to use the bathroom. He looked annoyed, but didn't want me making a mess in the store. He called his partner over and told him to watch me while he kept guard. They cut the zip ties on my feet and led me to the bathroom at the back of the store. Once inside, I pretended to struggle with the zip ties on my hands. I asked the man to help me. He seemed irritated but leaned in to cut them off. As soon as my hands were free, I shoved him as hard as I could into the wall and ran out of the bathroom. I heard him yell, but I didn't look back. I sprinted to the counter and hit the silent alarm button. The man with the gun realized what I had done and started shouting. He fired a shot, but it missed and shattered a bottle of soda behind me. I ducked behind the counter, my heart pounding. The police were on their way, but I knew it would take a few minutes for them to get there. The men started to panic. They crapped their bags and tried to make a run for it. I stayed hidden, praying they wouldn't come back for me. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. The men made a break for the back door just as the police arrived. I stayed down, too scared to move, until I heard the police shouting and the men being taken down. An officer came into the store and found me behind the counter, still shaking. He helped me up and took me outside. It was over. The police arrested the men and took my statement. They told me I was brave for hitting the alarm, but I didn't feel brave. I was just glad it was over. And then I was alive. My boss came to the store and he thanked me for what I did, but all I could think about was how close I had come to not making it out that night. Changed me. I still worked at the store, but I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I was delivering food for a local restaurant. It was summer and the heat was intense. I had a lot of orders that day and I was just trying to get through them. I got an order for an apartment complex on the other side of town. It was one of those older buildings that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, the kind with cracked walls and broken lights in the hallway. I found the apartment number easily enough when I knocked on the door. It took a moment for someone to answer. A tall guy with tattoos opened the door, looking at me with suspicion. He asked if I had the food and I nodded, holding up the bag. He stepped aside to let me in, saying something about how he needed to get the money from his friend. Inside, as soon as I stepped into the apartment, I knew something was off. There were 3 other men in the living room, sitting around a table covered with small bags of white powder. One of them was counting money. The air was thick with tension. They all looked up at me, and the room went silent. The guy who led me and closed the door behind me and locked it. My heart started pounding. I realized I had walked into a drug deal. The men stared at me, and I could see the fear and suspicion in their eyes. One of them, a man with a scar on his cheek, stood up and walked towards me. He asked who I was and why I was there. I explained quickly, showing them the bag of food and telling them I was just a delivery person. The scared man snatched the bag from me and dumped the contents on the table. He didn't seem interested in the food at all. He looked at his friends and said something in a low voice. I couldn't make up the words, but I knew they were deciding what to do with me. I felt trapped and my mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of there. The man with a scar told me to sit down. I did as he said, my legs shaking. They started asking me questions. How I found the place, if I told anyone I was coming, if anyone was expecting me back soon. I tried to stay calm and answer them without giving them a reason to hurt me. One of the men suggested that they couldn't let me leave. He said I had seen too much. The others nodded in agreement. My heart sank. I had to think of something fast. I told them that I hadn't seen anything, that I didn't care about what they were doing, and I just wanted to leave. They didn't look convinced. The scarred man leaning close, his face just inches from mine, he said that they couldn't take any chances. I felt panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of there. I noticed the door to the kitchen was open, and there was a window in there. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath, and then, with all the strength I could muster, I shoved the scar man away from me and bolted for the kitchen. The men shouted and scrambled to stop me. I reached the kitchen and saw the window was partially open. I yanked it up and started to climb through. Just as I was halfway out, I felt hands grabbing my legs, trying to pull me back in. I kicked and thrashed, managing to break free. I fell to the CR outside, scraping my arms and legs. I didn't stop to look back. I got up and landed as fast as I could. I heard the men shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the alley behind the building, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I kept running until I reached a busy street. I looked around trying to figure out where I was. I saw a convenience store and ran inside. I told the clerk to call the police, that I was in danger. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he made the call. I stayed there hiding behind the counter until the police arrived. When they got there, I told them everything that happened. They took my statement and promised to look into it. I never went back to that part of town again. I quit my job at the restaurant the next day. It was a sweltering summer evening when I decided to head to the parking garage. After finishing up some errands downtown, I was tired, but still had a bit of shopping to do, so I parked my car and started walking towards the entrance of the garage. It was one of those old structures with narrow aisles and dim lighting, the kind that always feels a bit too quiet. As I was walking down the ramp, I noticed a commotion near the back of the garage. I stopped and squinted, trying to make out what was happening. There were 3 men surrounding another guy who looked like he was pleading with them. My heart skipped a beat. It didn't look like a friendly conversation. I was about to turn around and go back to my car when I saw one of the men grab the other guy and slam him against the wall. The victim was struggling, and I could see that they were trying to take something from him. I knew I had to do something, but I was torn between wanting to help and worrying about my own safety. I decided to step in, hoping to break things up before it got worse. I walked up to them and tried to sound as calm and confident as I could. I told them to back off and leave the guy alone. The 3 men turned and looked at me. They didn't seem pleased. One of them, a burly man with a tattoo on his arm, took a step towards me and said something that sounded threatening. I told them again to stop and called 911 on my phone, hoping that the sight of me dialing would make them reconsider their actions. They seemed to be more annoyed than scared. One of them, the one who had been holding the victim, pulled out a knife and waved it in my direction. I felt a rush of fear, but tried to stay calm. The man with the knife started shouting at me, telling me to mind my own business. I realized that if I stayed, I could be in real danger. I quickly ended the call, said I was going to call the police again, and turned to leave. As I walked away, I could hear them shouting behind me. I knew they wouldn't just let me go easily. I made it to my car and tried to lock the doors, but my hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble with the key. I finally managed to get inside and started the engine. As I was about to drive away, I saw the 3 men running towards the entrance of the garage. They were clearly looking for me. I sped out of the parking garage, my heart racing. I knew I needed to get somewhere safe and report what I had seen. I drove to the nearest police station, which was a few miles away. On the way, I kept checking my mirrors, paranoid that they might be following me. When I got to the police station, I ran inside and explained what had happened. The officers took my statement and said they would send someone to check out the garage. They seemed to take it seriously. But I still felt anxious the whole time I was there. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see those men coming after me. After giving my statement, I left the station and drove home. I stayed alert, checking my surroundings every few minutes. I even changed my route a couple of times to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows and felt a wave of relief. The whole experience left me shaking. I kept thinking about the man who was being attacked and hoped that the police were able to help him. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had made things worse by intervening. For the next few days, I stayed on edge, constantly checking to make sure no one was lurking around my apartment. I didn't see any signs of those men, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I was scared to go out alone and try to stay in walled areas. Whenever I did, eventually, I had learned from the police that they had apprehended the men and that the victim was safe. I was relieved, but still troubled by the whole ordeal. It took me a while to feel comfortable going out again, and even now, I am more cautious about intervening in situations like that. The summer heat seemed to linger even after the incident, and every time I went near a parking garage, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had been looking forward to the Owls party for weeks. It was supposed to be a fun summer get-together with old friends and some new faces. To have a guy named Mark had been a friend from college, and when he invited me, I was excited to catch up. The party was a large house on the outskirts of town. It had a nice spacious backyard and a pool. When I arrived, the atmosphere was lively. People were chatting, drinking, and enjoying the music. I quickly found my friends enjoying them, but something felt off. Around an hour into the party, I noticed a small group of people who seemed to be acting a bit differently from the rest. They were standing off to the side, talking in hushed tones. Their behavior made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off as just being a different group of friends. As the evening went on, things started to get more strange. I saw one of the quiet group members, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, disappear into the kitchen with Mark. I could hear them talking loudly, but the words were too muffled to make out. My curiosity got the better of me, so I quietly followed them. I crept up to the kitchen and peered around the corner. I saw Mark and the tall guy discussing something in low voices. Mark handed him a small bag, and the tall guy nodded and left the room. I couldn't make out what was in the bag, but it didn't look like something you'd see at a party. My anxiety grew. I decided to stay close, not wanting to get too involved, but needing to understand what was happening. I moved back to the main area and tried to enjoy the party, but I kept an eye on Mark and the tall guy. Later, I noticed that Mark seemed more agitated. He was talking to a few more people from the quiet group, and they were glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. Micah told me that something was definitely not right. I started feeling a bit trapped. The place was crowded, and the exits were somewhat blocked by people. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. I needed to find out more and get out of there before things escalated. I made my way outside to get some fresh air. The backyard was quieter, with only a few people around. As I stood by the pool, I saw the tall guy again, but this time he was with another person I hadn't seen before. They were having a heated conversation, and the talk I seemed very agitated. I overheard snippets of their conversation. Words like shipment and deal were thrown around. My heart started pounding. It was clear they were discussing something illegal, and it was happening right under everyone's noses. I realized I needed to leave before things got any worse. I made my way to the front of the house, hoping to slip out unnoticed. Just as I was about to open the door, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Marky. Looked nervous and asked me if everything was okay. I tried to stay calm and said I just needed some fresh air. Mark seemed to hesitate, but eventually let me go. I stepped out into the night, but my relief was short-lived. As I walked to my car, I saw the Tala watching me from the driveway. I quickened my pace and fumbled with my car keys. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely unlock the door. I could feel the Talgu's gaze on me, and it made my skin crawl. I finally managed to get into my car and start the engine as I drove away. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the tall guy and a couple of others from the quiet group standing by the driveway. Watching me, my heart raced and I drove as fast as I could, making sure I wasn't followed. Once I was back on familiar roads, I felt a bit safer, but still very shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. When I got home, I locked all the doors and made sure all the windows were secure. I reported the incident to the police, but they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. I never went back to any parties at Mark's place again. The whole night had left me on edge, and I stayed cautious about any similar more gatherings in the future. I had been driving through the desert for hours heading back from a weekend getaway. The road stretched out in front of me, with only the occasional flicker of distant lights and the fast darkness surrounding me. It was around midnight. I noticed a car behind me that seemed to be following too closely. At first I thought it was just me imagination. I could see the headlights in my rearview mirror, but it was hard to judge if they were too close. The road was empty and there was no other traffic around. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling of being watched was unsettling. After a while, I realized that the car behind me wasn't just following, it was tailgating me aggressively. Every time I changed lanes or adjusted my speed, the car did the same. It was clear now that the driver had malicious intent. My heartbeat can't race. I tried to shake them off by speeding up, but the car behind me tapped up effortlessly. The headlights were blinding in my rearview mirror, and I could barely see the road. I was beginning to panic. There were no exits or towns around. It was just miles of empty highway. I took a deep breath and tried to think. I decided to make a sudden turn off the main road, hoping to lose them on one of the smaller dirt roads. I turned sharply into a narrow path that seemed to lead into the desert. The car behind me followed without hesitation. The dirt road was bumpy and uneven. I could hear the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and the headlights of the pursuing car were still visible in the distance. My attempts to lose them were futile. The car behind me was relentless. I needed to find a way to get out of this situation. I saw a small isolated building in the distance. It looked like an old maintenance shack or something similar. I pulled up close to it and turned off my headlights. I ducked down in my seat and tried to make myself as small as possible. My breath felt heavy and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The pursuing car slowed down and stopped. Nearby, I could see the headlights through the gaps in the building's walls. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. I had to do something to get away. I'd waited for what felt like an eternity, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The car seemed to be idling outside, and I could see shadowy figures moving around. It was clear that they were looking for me. I had to find a way to get back to the highway and seek help. When I felt it was safe, I quietly started my car and drove away from the building. I stayed off the main road, keeping to the darker paths and trying to stay hidden. The headlights of the pursuing car were still visible in the distance, but they seemed to be fading as I continued to drive. Eventually, I reached a more populated area where I could see a few scattered lights in the distance. I pulled into a gas station that was still open, hoping that the presence of other people would discourage the car from continuing its pursuit. I went inside, and the cashier noticed my distressed state. I explained the situation, and they called the police for me. I stayed at the gas station until the authorities arrived. When they checked the area, they didn't find any sign of the car that had been following me. I was relieved, but still shaken. The police advised me to be cautious and to avoid driving alone late at night, especially in isolated areas. I took their advice seriously and made sure to stay aware of my surroundings. In the future, that night in the desert was one of the scariest experiences of my life. The fear of being pursued by someone with unknown intentions was overwhelming. I had booked a last-minute stay at a hotel in a small town for a relaxing summer Break, I needed some time away from my hectic schedule, and this place looked perfect for a quiet getaway. The hotel was old but charming, with vintage decor and a cozy atmosphere. I arrived late in the afternoon and checked in without any issues. The front desk clerk, a young woman with a kind smile, handed me the key to my room and gave me directions. I was tired from the drive, so I headed straight to my room, eager to unwind. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a group of men loitering near the lobby. They were dressed in dark clothes and kept glancing towards me as I walked past. It felt a bit odd, but I brushed it off. As I settled into my room, I heard muffled voices in the hallway and the sound of heavy footsteps. It was odd, but I tried to ignore it. I was in the middle of reading a book when there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I peed through the peephole, I saw two men in suits standing outside. They looked serious and seemed impatient. I opened the door cautiously, and one of the men introduced himself as a detective. He said there had going a mix-up with the hotel booking and asked if he could come in to ask a few questions. I was taken aback, but let them in, hoping it was just a routine check. They started asking questions about my background, my reason for visiting, and my plans while I was in town. I answered everything truthfully, thinking it was just standard procedure, but their questions seemed to delve deeper and felt oddly intrusive. The men seemed unsatisfied with my answers and started looking around my room. I began to feel uneasy. One of them even asked if I had been in contact with anyone unusual. I had no idea what they were talking about. When I tried to ask what this was about, they avoided giving a clear answer. They only said there had been some confusion and that they needed to check something. The whole situation felt wrong, and I started to get anxious. The detective's demeanor was intimidating, and I felt trapped. After they left, I tried to call the hotel manager to get some clarity, but the line was busy. I decided to go downstairs to see if I could find out more. Cobby was eerily quiet, and the front desk clerk was nowhere to be found. The group of men I had seen earlier was now gathered around a corner talking quietly. I tried to approach them, but they quickly dispersed when they saw me coming. I felt more uneasy than ever. I knew I had to get out of the hotel and find a safe place, but I didn't know who to trust. I decided to leave and find a nearby police station to explain what was happening. As I walked towards the exit, I noticed a man following me. He was trying to stay hidden, but I could see him in the reflection of the glass doors. My heart raced. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose him. I reached the parking lot and saw my car, but I hesitated. If the man was working with the detectives, I wouldn't be safe there. I looked around and saw a small diner across the street. I headed there, hoping to find some help or at least get away from the hotel. Inside the diner, I explained my situation to the waitress and asked to use the phone. She let me use the phone. In the back room, I managed to get through to the local police and explained everything. They said they would send someone over to the diner to help me. While waiting, I stayed inside the diner, trying to stay calm. When the police arrived, they took my statement and assured me they would look into the situation. They contacted the hotel and the supposed detectives. It turned out that the men were not real detectives, but imposters involved in a criminal scheme. They had been using the hotel as a front to look for people to intimidate, and the real police were able to secure the hotel and arrest the imposters. I was relieved but shaken by the whole experience. The hotel manager apologized for the mix-up and offered to move me to a different room, but I declined. I packed up my things and checked out as soon as I could. The local police gave me a safe route out of town and advised me to report any further suspicious activity. I drove back home, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The experience had been terrifying, and it took me a while to shake off the anxiety. I was on vacation in a rented cabin in the woods, looking forward to a peaceful summer getaway. The cabin was remote but charming, and I planned to spend my days hiking and my nights relaxing. It was supposed to be a break from my busy life, but things took a turn for the worst. One night, it was around Midnight, when I was woken up by a loud knock on the cabin door, I was startled as I hadn't expected any visitors, especially at this hour. I checked the time on my phone. It was well past midnight. I hesitated, not sure if I should answer. I had read about incidents where people were lured into danger with late night knocks. The knocking persisted, louder and more urgent. I slowly got out of bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and checked through the peephole. I saw a man standing on the porch, looking disheveled and frightened. He was pacing back and forth, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I opened the door a crack and asked him what was wrong. The man quickly pushed the door open lighter and stepped inside. He was visibly shaking and said he had been chased by some dangerous people. His story was incoherent at first, but I caught bits and pieces about a car following him and threats made by unknown individuals. I felt a surge of fear. The situation felt off. Who were these people chasing him? Why did he choose my cabin? I wanted to help, but I also didn't want to put myself in danger. I tried to stay calm and asked him for more details about what had happened. He explained that he had been driving and noticed a car following him. The car started tailing him aggressively, and he had taken a few turns to try and lose them. He said he had driven for miles, eventually finding my cabin by chance. His story seemed plausible, but I was still on edge. I could feel the weight of the decision I had to make. I could let him stay, which might put me at risk if the people were really after him, or I could send him away and risk him being in danger. I decided to call the police. I told them what had happened and provided them with the details. The stranger had given me the dispatcher on the other end, assured me they would send someone to check things out. I felt a bit better knowing that help was on the way. While waiting for the police to arrive, I made the stranger sit in the living room while I kept a close eye on him from a distance. He looked exhausted and scared. He repeatedly thanked me for letting him in, saying he didn't know what he would have done if he had to keep running. The knocking started again, but this time it was more forceful. I went to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw two men standing outside. They looked like they meant business. I felt a rush of panic and moved away from the door. I told the stranger what I saw and asked him to stay hidden. I grabbed a phone and quietly dialed the police again, letting them know about the new development. I could hear the men outside talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I felt trapped, my mind raised with thoughts of what might happen next. The police arrived not long after, and I quickly opened the door for them. They took in the scene and began questioning the stranger. They seemed to be taking his story seriously. They also spoke with the men who were now standing outside, trying to make sense of the situation. The police talked to the men and then came inside to speak with me. They confirmed that the men outside were indeed looking for the stranger, but they were not from any official agency. They were involved in some kind of illegal activity and had been trying to intimidate the stranger into silence. I was relieved to hear that the situation was under control. The police escorted the men away and assured me they would keep an eye out for any further trouble. They also took a statement from me, and the stranger then left to continue their investigation. With the immediate danger gone, I finally let myself relax. The stranger thanked me profusely and left the cabin under police protection. I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The night had been incredibly stressful, and I was glad it had ended safely. The rest of my vacation was uneventful, and I stayed alert just in case. I learned to be more cautious and to trust my instincts even though the situation was scary. I was glad I had made the right choices and managed to keep myself and the stranger safe. I was on a solo vacation in Miami, finally taking a break from work. I had booked a room at a small hotel right on the beach, hoping for some rest and relaxation. Everything seemed perfect. When I arrived, sunshine, sand, and a view that made the long drive worthwhile. When I checked in, the receptionist gave me my key and directed me to my room. As I made my way to the elevator, I noticed a man standing outside a room with a suitcase. I assumed he was waiting for someone, or maybe just checking in. I got to my room, opened the door, and was greeted by the familiar smell of hotel cleaning products. I unpacked my bags and settled in for a quiet evening. Just as I was about to unwind, I heard a knock on my door. It was the same man I had seen earlier. He introduced himself as Jason and told me there had been a mix-up with the booking system. It turned out that my room had been double booked. I was surprised, but didn't think much of it. The hotel staff had already arranged for Jason to be moved to another room. He said he was just waiting for the new room to be ready and asked if he could hang out in mine until then. I agreed, thinking it was a minor inconvenience and that he seemed harmless enough. We chatted briefly, and he told me he was in town for a conference. After about an hour, Jason's room was ready. He thanked me and laughed. I locked my door behind him and felt relieved that the situation was resolved. That night I heard some noise outside my room, but dismissed it as people coming in late from the beach. I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I listened for any signs of trouble. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and then a soft knock on my door. I peered through the peephole and saw Jason standing there. I was confused. I opened the door slightly and asked if everything was all right. He said he had forgotten something in my room and needed to come in to get it. I hesitated, but eventually let him in. He looked nervous, and his demeanor had changed since earlier. He started looking around the room and seemed agitated. He told me he had misplaced some important documents and was getting anxious. I tried to calm it down and suggested we call the hotel staff for help. Jason snapped at me, saying he couldn't afford any delays. His voice was suddenly harsh, and I could see a different side of him that made me uneasy. I wanted to ask him to leave, but didn't want to provoke him. As he continued to search the room, I noticed his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. He started pacing and muttering to himself. My instinct told me something was off, and I felt a growing sense of danger. I decided it was time to get him out of my room. I told him I needed to use the bathroom and asked him to wait outside. I slipped into the bathroom, locked the door, and quickly called the hotel front desk. I explained the situation and asked for help. The receptionist assured me they would send someone up right away. While I was on the phone, I heard Jason trying to open the bathroom door. His knocking turned into pounding, and I could hear him yelling. My heart pounded as I realized he was trying to force his way in. I stayed silent and listened for any sounds of movement outside. I could hear footsteps approaching my room, and then the sound of the door opening. The hotel staff had arrived, and Jason's yelling grew louder before it abruptly stopped after what felt like an eternity. There was a knock on the bathroom door. It was one of the hotel staff asking if I was all right. I opened the door and quickly explained what had happened. They assured me that Jason had been restrained and that the police were on their way. The police arrived shortly after and took Jason into custody. He was charged with several offenses, including her harassment and trespassing. The hotel staff apologized for the mix-up and offered to move me to a different room for the remainder of my stay. The rest of the vacation was uneventful, but the incident left me shaking. I was grateful for the quick response of the hotel staff and the police. I learned to trust my instincts and be more cautious, especially when dealing with strangers. Despite the scary experience, I managed to enjoy the rest of my trip, focusing on the beautiful beach and the relaxation I had initially sought. The hotel staff were supportive, and I felt safe. Once the situation was resolved, I rented a cabin by a lake to work on my novel. The place was quiet, perfect for writing. It was old but cozy. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and the trees around it rustled softly in the breeze. I thought it was just what I needed to get away from the noise of the city. On the second day, I noticed something odd about the cabin. There was a section of the floor in the living room that sounded hollow. When I walked over it, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I moved the rug and saw a trapdoor. It took some effort to pry it open, but I managed. Below was a small dark room. I used my phone's flashlight to look around. There were old dusty boxes and a table with a few papers scattered on it. I climbed down and started going through the boxes. Most of them had old clothes and books, but one had photos of a man tied to a chair, bruised and bleeding. My heart started pounding. This wasn't what I expected to find. I went through the papers on the table. There were notes about the man in the photos. They talked about debts and warnings, and how he wouldn't listen. It was clear he had been tortured. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to leave, but I heard a noise from above. Someone was in the cabin. I froze, listening. Footsteps moved across the floor, then stopped. I heard voices. They were talking about coming back to check on the place, making sure no one found anything. Panic set, and I had to get out of there, but I couldn't go up. Now they would see me. I stayed as quiet as possible, hoping they wouldn't come down. They moved around, checking rooms, talking about the last time they were there. One of them mentioned the guy in the photos. My heart sank. They were the ones who did this. I had to think fast. I saw a small window near the ceiling of the hidden low. It was a tight squeeze, but I could fit. I carefully climbed up and pushed it open, trying not to make any noise. I squeezed through and fell into the bushes. Outside, I heard one of the men coming closer, so I stayed low and crawled away from the cabin. Once I was far enough, I got up and ran. I didn't know where to go, just away. The woods were thick, and I stumbled a few times, but I kept going. I found a spot to hide and catch my breath. My mind was racing. I needed to get help, but my phone was still in the cabin. I decided to head towards the nearest town. It was a few miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I kept off the main paths, sticking to the trees. I didn't want them to find me. Every noise made me jump. I was scared they were following me. It started getting dark, and I was still in the woods. I found a large tree and ate behind it, trying to stay calm. I waited for a while, listening for any signs of them. It was quiet, but I didn't feel safe. I needed to keep moving. I finally saw lights in the distance. It was the town. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't relax yet. I hurried towards the lights, trying to stay hidden. I reached the edge of the town and saw a gas station. I went inside and asked the clerk to call the police. The police arrived quickly. I told them everything, from the room to the men in the cabin. They took me seriously and sent officers to check it out. They found the cabin and the room, but the men were gone. They said I did the right thing by running. They took me to the station to get my statement. It was late, and I was exhausted, but I was safe. They promised to investigate and keep me updated. I was just glad to be away from that cabin. A few days later, they called. They found the man. They had a history of crime, including the kidnapping and torture of the man in the photos. They were arrested, and I felt a sense of relief knowing they were caught. I went back to the city, deciding I had enough of cabins and lakes for a while. It was a terrifying experience, but I was glad alive. I'm more cautious now, but I still love writing. I just do it from the safety of my apartment. I was waiting for the last train home. It was late, and the platform was almost empty. Just a few people scattered around. I tried to keep to myself, but I noticed a man standing a bit further down, still staring at me. I pushed it off at first, thinking he might just be zoning out or looking at something behind me, but his eyes never moved. The train finally arrived, and I hurried to get on. I picked an empty car, hoping for some peace and quiet. As I settled into a seat by the window, I saw him get on the same car. Out of all the empty seats, he chose the one directly across from me. I felt a chill run down on my spine. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, but I could feel his eyes on me. Every time I glanced up, he was staring, unblinking. My heart started to race, and I thought about moving to another car, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or rude. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I told myself. But then he started talking. Late night for you too. His voice was low and loopy. I nodded, not really wanting to engage. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. You shouldn't be out this late. It's not safe for someone like you. I didn't respond. I just stared at my phone, praying he'd get the hint and leave me alone, but he didn't. He kept talking, asking where I was going, if I lived alone, why I did for work. His questions were invasive and made me Uncomfortable, I answered as briefly as possible, hoping he'd get bored and stop. The train moved through each station, and no one else got on. It was just me and him. I considered getting off at the next stop and waiting for another train, but I didn't want to be stuck on an empty platform with him. I decided to stay put and get off at my usual stop. He seemed to sense my discomfort and lean back still, staring. I tried to think of ways to distract myself, but nothing worked. My thoughts were consumed by fear. The train announced my stop, and I stood up hoping he'd stay behind, but he stood up too, following me to the door. I stepped off the train, my heart pounding. The platform was deserted, and I could hear his footsteps behind me. I walked quickly, trying to get to the exit, but he matched my pace. "Wait up," he called, his voice echoing in the empty station. I broke into a run, not caring if I seemed paranoid anymore. I could hear him running after me, his footsteps getting closer. I reached the stairs and bolted up them, my breath coming in short gasps. I glanced back and saw him gaining on me. Panic set in, and I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with effort. I burst out of the station and into the street. It was dark, and the few street lights cast long shadows. I spotted a convenience store a block away and ran towards it, hoping for safety. I could still hear him behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the store and burst through the doors, startling the cashier. I ran to the back, hiding behind a shelf, trying to catch my breath. I heard the man into the store, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I peeked through the shelves and saw him looking around, searching for me. I cracked my phone and dialed 911, whispering my location to the operator. I stayed hidden, praying the police would arrive soon. The man walked down each aisle, getting closer to my hiding spot. My heart was in my throat, and I could barely breathe. Just as he reached the aisle, I was in the sound of sirens, felt the air. He froze, his eyes narrowing. He turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the night. I stayed hidden until the police arrived. Too scared to move, they took my statement and escorted me home, promising to patrol the area. I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. Even in the safety of my apartment, I double-checked the locks and closed the curtains, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every noise made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't won that night. Changed everything for me. I was home alone during summer break. My parents were on a trip, and I had the house to myself. It was late, and I was lying in bed, almost asleep. Suddenly, I heard clash shattering downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. I thought it might be a train, but then I heard footsteps. I got out of bed quietly and crept to my bedroom door. I opened at a crack and peeked out into the hallway. It was dark and silent, but I could hear the faint sounds of movement downstairs. I needed to get my phone to call the police, but I had left it in the living room. I cursed myself for being so careless. I tiptoed out of my room and headed for the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. As I got closer to the stairs, I heard voices. Two men were talking in hushed tones. They sounded like they were searching for something. I crouched down and peeped through the banister. I could see shadows moving in the living room. I needed to find a way to get to my phone without being seen. I decided to go through the kitchen, which had a door that led to the living room. I slowly made my way downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the kitchen and paused, listening. The men were still in the living room, their voices low but urgent. I moved quietly, inching towards the kitchen door. I opened it slowly, hoping it wouldn't creak. I could see the living room now. One of the men was rummaging through drawers while the other was looking at the shelves. My phone was on the coffee table, just a few feet away from them. I took a deep breath and crawled on the floor, staying as low as possible. I moved slowly, my eyes never leaving the burglar. I was almost at the coffee table when one of them turned around. I froze, my heart stopping. He looked right at me, but he didn't seem to see me. I stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't notice. After a moment, he turned back to his search. I reached the coffee table and grabbed my phone. I crawled back to the kitchen, my heart still Racing, I made it to the kitchen and closed the door behind me as quietly as I could. I dialed 911, my hand shaking. I whispered to the operator, telling them about the burglar. They said they would send officers right away and told me to stay hidden. I found a spot behind the kitchen counter where I could watch the living room door. I waited, my phone clutched in my hand. The burglars were still searching, oblivious to my presence. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I heard one of the burglars say they needed to hurry up. They sounded frustrated, like they weren't finding what they were looking for. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The burglars heard them too and panicked. They grabbed a few things and ran towards the back door. I stayed hidden, not daring to move. I heard the back door slam and the sound of footsteps running away. The sirens grew louder, and soon I saw flashing lights outside. The police had arrived. I stayed behind the counter until I heard the police calling out, announcing their presence. I stood up and walked to the front door, my leg shaky. I opened the door and saw two officers standing there. They asked if I was okay, and I nodded, feeling a rush of relief. I told them what had happened, and they searched the house to make sure the burglar were gone. They took my statement and said they would investigate. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were worried but glad I was safe. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The police never caught the burglar, but they said I did the right thing by staying hidden and calling for help. It was a terrifying experience, and I was just glad it was over. The forest was quiet, and I enjoyed the solitude. After a few hours, I realized I had lost the trail. My phone had no signal, and I began to worry. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. As the sun began to set, I spotted a cabin hidden among the trees. Relieved, I approached it, hoping to find help. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The place looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked. I decided to go inside. The cabin was dark and smelled musty. There was old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. I called out, but there was no response. I found a flashlight on a table and turned it on. The beam of light revealed more of the cabin, and I know not strange things. There were maps and photos pinned to the walls. The photos showed people who looked scared or hurt. My stomach churned. I went into another room and found a table with tools that looked like they were used for torture. My heart raced, and I felt sick. I knew I had to leave, but I heard footsteps outside. Panic set in. I turned off the flashlight and hid behind a large cabinet. The door creaked open, and I heard voices. Two men entered, talking in low, angry tones. They mentioned someone escaping and needing to find them. I stayed as still as I could, trying to control my breathing. The men moved around the cabin, and I could hear them getting closer. One of them stopped near the cabinet. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. After a tense moment, they moved on. They discussed plans to search the forest. In the morning, my mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape. When they went into another room, I quietly moved to the door. I peeked out and saw them busy with something, giving me a chance to slip out. I made my way back into the forest, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The darkness made it hard to see, and I stumbled several times. I kept going, fearing they would discover I was gone and come after me. The forest seemed endless. I heard rustling behind me and froze. The men were looking for me with flashlights. I ducked behind a tree, hoping they wouldn't see me. They passed by, their lights cutting through the darkness. I waited until they were far enough away before moving again. Hours passed, and I felt exhausted. My legs were sore, and my throat was dry. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction, but I kept moving. The sky began to lighten as dawn approached, giving me a bit more visibility. I found a stream and drank some water, trying to gather my strength. I heard voices again and knew the men were still searching. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of wire helped mask my footsteps. Eventually, I saw clearing up ahead. My heart lifted with hope. As I got closer, I saw a road. Relief washed over me. I climbed up to the road and looked around. There was no sign of the man. I started walking, hoping to find help. Soon after what felt like hours, I saw a car Approaching, I waved frantically, and it stopped. The driver looked concerned and asked if I was okay. I told him everything in a rush, and he offered to take me to the nearest town. I gratefully accepted. We arrived at the town and I went straight to the police. I told them about the cabin, and the men, they took my statement and said they would investigate. I felt a mix of relief and fear, hoping the men would be caught. I was home one evening just relaxing. After work my phone buzzed and I picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or some random notification. Instead, there was a text from an unknown number. It said, "Nice book you're reading." I glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy, but then brushed it off as a weird prank. I didn't think much of it and went back to my book. The next day I got another text from the same number. This time it said, "Red really suits you." I was wearing a red dress. My heart started pounding. I walked over to the window, looked outside, and saw nothing unusual. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. That evening I got another text. "Dinner looks delicious." I was making pasta. I dropped the spoon and looked around my apartment, my hand shaking. It felt like someone was in the room with me, watching every move I made. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. The text kept coming, describing everything I did. "You should get some last." I was heading to bed. Nice pajamas. I was wearing my favorite PJs. I felt trapped in my own home, like there was no escape from whoever was watching me. I couldn't see any cameras or signs of someone being inside, but I felt their eyes on me all the time. I called my friend Jenny and told her what was happening. She was worried and offered to come over, but I told her I would be fine. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. I decided to try and figure it out on my own. I stayed up all night trying to find any clues, but there was nothing. Just more texts. The next day, I went to the police. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They told me to stay safe and contact them if anything escalated. I felt helpless and frustrated. The continued getting more personal and detailed. "You look tired." I hadn't slept in days. "That's a beautiful necklace." I was wearing a necklace my mom gave me. "You can't hide from me." I was curled up in the corner of my bedroom, feeling more terrified than ever. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started looking around my apartment again, more carefully this time. I checked behind picture frames, under furniture, and inside every little nook and cranny. Finally, I found a small camera hidden inside a vent in the living room. It was positioned to see almost the entire apartment. I felt sick to my stomach. I took the camera to the police, hoping they could trace it back to whoever was behind this. They said they would investigate, but it would take time. Meanwhile, the texts kept coming. "Nice find." The stalker knew I found the camera. I felt more vulnerable than ever. I decided to stay at a hotel for a few nights, hoping to get away from the constant surveillance. But the texts followed me. "Their 2-room 302 nice choice." My blood ran cold. I was no longer safe anywhere. I called Jenny again, and she insisted on staying with me. We both felt safer together, but the texts kept coming, describing everything we did, having a friend over. I see. We tried to block the number, but new ones kept appearing. Desperate, we started searching online for any information that could help us. We found stories of other people experiencing similar things, but no clear solutions. We felt lost and scared. The texts became more threatening. "You can't escape. I'm always watching." One night, while Jenny and I were talking, I got a text saying, "Look outside." We hesitated, but then peeked through the curtains. A figure was standing across the street, staring at my apartment. I couldn't make up their face, but I knew it was the stalker. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. Feeling completely trapped, we decided to stay with Jenny's brother, who lived out of town. We hoped the distance would help. For a few days it was quiet. No texts, no signs of being watched. I started to relax, thinking it might finally be over. Then one evening a text came through. "Nice place." The stalker had found us again. I felt like breaking down, but Jenny's Brother Mark was determined to help. He had a background in security and promised to keep us safe. He set up cameras around his house and made sure all the doors and windows were secure. We stayed vigilant, waiting for any sign of the stalker. One night we heard a noise outside. Mark checked the cameras and saw a figure trying to tamper with one of them. He called the police and went outside with a baseball bat to confront them. The stalker ran off before Mark could get a good look, but the police arrived quickly and started a search. They found a car parked a few blocks away with equipment inside for surveillance. The car was traced back to a man who had a history of stalking and harassment. He was arrested, and we finally felt a sense of relief. The police told us it would take time to gather enough evidence for a conviction, but at least he was off the street for now. I moved to a new apartment with better security and kept in close contact with Jenny and Mark. The text stopped, and I started to feel safe again. It took time to rebuild my sense of security, but I knew I had strong people around me to help. It was late, and the rain was coming down hard, turning the roads into slick black mirrors. I had stayed late at the office, trying to finish a project that was due the next day. When I finally got out, the parking lot was nearly empty. I climbed into my car, exhausted, and started the drive home. Terrain was relentless, the kind that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full blast. I took it slow, barely able to make up the line lines on the road. As I drove through the quiet streets, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, just another car up late like me, I figured. But then the car got closer, much closer. I could see the outline of the vehicle in my mirror, the headlights almost blinding. I changed lanes, hoping they would pass, but they followed. My heart started to race. Maybe it was just a coincidence, I thought, trying to calm myself. I took a right turn onto a side street, thinking they would keep going straight. They didn't. They turned with me. I tightened on the steering wheel. I tried to shake them off, making a series of random turns, but they matched each one. The car got even closer, almost bumper to bumper. The driver flashed their eye beams, making it impossible to see. Panic set in. I sped up, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. They did the same, their car swerving dangerously close to mine. I needed to find a safe place to pull over and call for help. I scanned the streets for any sign of life, but it was late, and the rain had driven everyone inside. The streets were deserted. I thought about pulling into a gas station, but there weren't any around. My mind raced through options, trying to come up with a plan. I saw a sign for the highway up ahead and decided to take it. Maybe I could lose them with a higher speed and more traffic. I fled, the engine roaring as I merged onto the highway. The other car stayed right behind me, now swerving side to side, trying to push me off the road. My hands were shaking, and I struggled to keep control of the car. Terrain was so heavy, it was like driving through a waterfall. I prayed for a police car, any sign of help. Nothing. The highway was as empty as the streets had been. The car behind me ran into my bumper, sending a jolt through my body. I fought to keep the car steady. Another hit. I could hear the crunch of metal. I had to do something. I couldn't keep going like this. Up ahead, I saw an exit sign. It led to a more populated area. I decided to take it, hoping the streetlights and buildings would provide some safety. I took the exit at high speed, the tires screeching as I turned. The other car followed, still trying to ram me off the road. I sped through the streets, looking for any place that was open. I saw a 24-hour diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the rain. I aimed for it, praying the other car wouldn't follow me. Inside, I pulled into the parking lot, my tires sliding on the wet pavement. I jumped out of the car and ran for the door. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of people inside. The waitress looked up, startled, as I burst through the door, drenched and panting. Call the police, I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Someone's trying to kill me. She cracked the phone, her eyes wide with shock. I turned to look outside. The car had stopped at the entrance to the parking lot. The drivers sat there, engine running, headlights glaring into the diner. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like Hours the car sped off. As soon as they pulled in, I gave the officers my statement describing the car and what had happened. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I called a friend to pick me up to shake him to drive home. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that the driver would come back. Every car that passed made me jump. When my friend arrived, I felt a wave of relief, but knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. The police never found the car or the driver. I changed my routes always, looking over my shoulder, always on edge. It was pouring rain when I left the office that night. The storm had been built all day, and now it was a full-blown downpour. I hurried to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing at the entrance. He looked soaked even with his raincoat on. Need a ride? I called out. Tom smiled, relief. Thanks, Rachel, I appreciate it. He climbed into the passenger seat, and I cranked up the heat. We chatted about work as I navigated the slick roads. The rain was so heavy it was hard to see beyond a few feet. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. We came to a red light, and I glanced over at Tom. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming on his knee. Everything okay? I asked. He nodded but didn't say anything. The light turned green, and I started to drive. A few blocks later, I noticed Tom wasn't in the car anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising. How could he just disappear? I got out, looking around, calling his name. The rain was relentless, soaking me. In seconds, there was no sign of him anywhere. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Did he jump out? Why didn't I hear anything? I decided to head back to the office, thinking maybe he had gone back there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked up. I knocked on the door, hoping the night guard might have seen something. No answer. I was alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he vanished, but there was no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but their tone made it clear they thought he probably just decided to walk home. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold and the fear something was very wrong. I decided to go to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I banged on his door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. I jumped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. You looking for Tom? He asked. I nodded. Have you seen him? He shook his head. Not since this morning. Is something wrong? I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. Tom's been acting strange lately. He mentioned something about being followed, but I thought he was just stressed from work. Rain kept pounding down. As I got back into my car, my phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Rachel, a voice said it was Tom, but he sounded scared. Tom, where are you? I don't have much time. Don't trust them, he whispered. Thane went dead. My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black sea that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, it was right there behind me. Panic set in. I took a sharp turn down a side street and sped up, hoping to lose them. My heart was pounding as I navigated the narrow, rain-slicked roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cars still behind me. I drove towards the outskirts of town, hoping the winding roads would help me shake them. The car was relentless, though staying on me. Tail, I saw a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the car bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest. The trees closed and around me, and the headlights of the car behind me disappeared. I kept driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off my engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain hammering on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had disappeared. I couldn't go home. It wasn't safe after what felt like hours. The rain finally started to let up. I decided to head back to town, keeping to the back roads. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I snuck in through a side door that I knew was always left unlocked. I crept up to Tom's apartment and picked the lock, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I'd need. Inside the place was a mass. Papers were scattered everywhere, and it looked like someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping for a clue. As I searched through his files, I found a folder marked Danger. Inside were documents and photos detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were pictures of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings and lists of names. It was all connected to some illegal activities that Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, searching through the mass. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door lock behind them. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding spot. I cracked Tom's laptop and slipped out of the apartment, heading back to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the files and figure out who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and checked in under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop again and went through everything. It was clear that Tom had stumbled onto something big, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night making copies of the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information was out and Tom was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had been leaked to the press, and the authorities were investigating. Finally, I got a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in a different city. He thanked me for helping him, and we agreed to lay low until things blew over. It took months for the dust to settle, but eventually the people behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things started to go back to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. It was late, and the rain was coming down hard. I could barely see the road through my windshield. My gas gauge was almost unempty, so I pulled into the first gas station. I saw it was nearly deserted. Just one other car parked under the awning. The station looked old and run down, but it was my only option. I got out of my car and ran to the door, trying to avoid getting too wet. The inside was dimly lit, and the smell of old coffee hung in the air. The attendant was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He greeted me as I came in. Rough can, he said, his voice growly. Yeah, just need some gas, I replied, trying to be polite, but not really wanting to engage in conversation. Sure thing, pumps on pay. When you're done, I nodded and headed back out to fill up my car. The rain was relentless, soaking me. In seconds, I hurried back inside. Once the tank was full, I handed the man at 20 and waited for my change as he fiddled with the cash register. I glanced around. The place was cluttered with old magazines, dusty shelves, and a faint hum of fluorescent lights. It gave me an uneasy feeling. Then I heard the sound of a lock clicking. I looked over and saw the attendant turning the key in the front door. My stomach dropped. What are you doing? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Just locking up for the night, he said, but his tone was different now, less friendly, more menacing. I need to go, I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my way. I don't think so, he said. Why don't you stay a while? We can have a little chat. Panic searched through me. I packed away, looking for another way out. The windows were barred, and there was only one other door behind the counter. I had to think fast. Please, I just want to leave, I pleaded, hoping to reason with him. He shook his head slowly, a creepy smile spreading across his face. You're not going Anywhere I glanced at the counter, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, there was a metal coffee pot. Within reach, I grabbed it and swung it at him. It hit his arm, and he stumbled back. Cursing, I took my chance and bolted for the door behind the counter. I pushed through and found myself in a small storage room. Boxes were piled high, and there was a faint smell of mildew. I frantically searched for another exit, but there was none. Footsteps approached, and I knew I didn't have much time. I spotted a metal shelf and shoved it against the door, hoping it would buy me some time. The door rolled as he tried to push it open. I could hear him shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart was pounding in my chest. I had to find a way out. I spotted a small window high up on the wall. That was my only chance. I climbed onto a stack of boxes and pushed at the window. It was stuck, but I used all my strength to force it open. The gap was small, that I managed to squeeze through. I dropped to the ground outside, the rain still pouring down. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I finally got the door open and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. I started the car and peeled out of the gas station, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw the attendant standing in the doorway, watching me with that same eerie smile. I didn't stop driving until I reached a busy highway. My heart was still racing, and I felt like I might be sick. I pulled over out while Russ stopped and called the police. I told them everything, but I didn't know if they would find him. I just wanted to get as far away from the place as possible. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that old sedan following me. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark, trying to calm down. I don't know what that man's plans were, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never stop at a deserted gas station again. I reconnected with an old friend from high school named Steve. We hadn't spoken in years, but we caught up over social media. Steve invited me to stay at his farmhouse for the weekend. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. When I arrived, Steve greeted me warmly. The farmhouse was old, but well kept. It stood alone in a vast field, miles from the nearest neighbor. We spent the evening reminiscing about our school days, laughing and drinking as the night wore on. Steve showed me to the guest room. It was simple, with a bed and a small dresser. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't place why. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just the years apart that made things feel different. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and every little creak made me jump around. Midnight, I heard voices coming from downstairs. Curious, I got out of bed and crept towards the door. The voices were clearer now. Steve was talking to someone else, someone I hadn't seen. I opened the door crack and listened. They were discussing something serious, their tones low and urgent. You can't let him leave, the other voice said. He knows too much now. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who were they talking about? I stayed still, trying to hear more. We'll take care of it in the morning, Steve replied. Make sure he doesn't suspect anything tonight. My heart pounded. They were talking about me. I had to get out of there. I closed the door quietly and looked around the room for my things. I crapped my backpack and shoes, moving as silently as I could. I remembered the car keys were downstairs in the living room. I would have to go down there past Steve and the other man. I took a deep breath and opened the door again, slipping into the hallway. The stairs creaked under my weight, but the voices in the kitchen masked the sound. I made it to the living room and spotted my keys on the coffee table. I picked them up, my hand trembling. I heard a chair scrape against the floor. They were moving. I had to hurry. I headed for the front door, but it was locked. The key was in the kitchen, where Steve and the other man were. I couldn't risk it. I needed another way out. I remembered the back door in the kitchen. Maybe there was a way to distract them. I looked around and saw the old phone on the wall. I picked it up and dialed 911, but I didn't say anything. I hid the open line would bring help. I hung up and moved towards the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Steve and the other man standing by the table. I had to create a distraction. I picked up a face from the table and threw it against the wall. The crash was loud, and the men turned towards the noise. I ducked into the shadows as they walked towards the living room, looking for the source. I slipped into the kitchen and headed for the back door. It was unlocked. I opened it slowly and stepped outside into the cold night air. I could hear the men searching the living room, their voices angry. I ran towards the barn, hoping to hide there until I could figure out my next move. The barn was dark and smelled of hay. I found a spot behind some old equipment and crouched down, trying to calm my breathing. I listened for any sounds of pursuit, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I heard the sound of a car engine starting, and I peeked out of the barn. The headlights of Steve's truck were on, and he was backing out of the driveway. He was leaving. I had to move. Quickly, I ran back to the house and grabbed my backpack from the living room. The front door was still locked, but I found a window that was slightly open. I pushed it up and climbed through, scraping my hands on the sill. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. I started the engine and drove off, my hand shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I parked at a gas station and called the police, telling them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate. They found the farmhouse empty. Steve and the other man were gone, and there was no sign of them. I never heard from Steve again, and I never went back to that farmhouse. I noticed a man early in the morning dressed in a utility worker uniform, in inspecting the houses on my street. He wore a art hat and had a tool belt slung around his waist. He seemed to be checking the meters or something. I didn't think much of it at first. Utility workers come by often enough. It wasn't until he lingered in front of my house longer than usual that I got suspicious. He kept glancing around nervously, which put me on edge. I decided to watch him for a bit from my window, just to be sure everything was all right. He moved to my front door and took out a small device, pretending to skin something. I felt a pit in my stomach. I knew something wasn't right. I kept watching, my heart pounding. He then walked around to the side of my house, out of my line of sight. I quickly moved to another window to keep an eye on him. That's when I saw him trying to open one of the windows. He was no utility worker. This was a burglar, plain and simple. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. My police training kicked in. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering the situation to the dispatcher. I didn't want to alert the burglar that I was onto him. I then went to my closet and pulled out my old service weapon. I hadn't used it in years, but kept it clean and ready just in case. I crept down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. I could hear the man now jiggling the window lock, muttering to himself. I positioned myself near the back door, my gun in hand. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't want to shoot unless I absolutely had to. The window finally gave way, and I heard him climbing inside. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. My canine to him stopped right there. I shouted. The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't expect anyone to be home, let alone armed. Get down on the ground, hands behind your head, I ordered. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered himself to the floor. I kept my gun trained on him, my heart racing. I didn't know if he was armed, but I couldn't take any chances. I moved closer, still keeping my distance. "Why are you breaking into my house?" I demanded. He didn't answer, just stared at me with a mix of fear and anger. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. Relief washed over me. The police arrived within minutes, bursting through the front door. I kept my gun pointed at the man until the officers took over, cuffing him and hauling him to his feet. I finally lowered my weapon, my hand shaking. One of the officers, a young woman, came over to me. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken up," I replied. She took my statement while her colleagues searched the man and the rest of the house. They found Berkey tools in his pocket and a knife. I shuddered at the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't been prepared. The officers led the man out to their patrol car, and I watched from the doorway, still in disbelief. After they left, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything. I sat down in the living room, trying to calm myself. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Someone had tried to invade my home, my sanctuary. I called my wife, who was out of town visiting family. I told her what happened, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the fear in my voice. She was shocked and worried, but I assured her I was okay. That night I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every creak of the house set my heart racing. I kept my gun close just in case. The image of the man's face, his wide eyes staring at me, was burned into my mind. In the days that followed, I installed a security system complete with cameras and alarms. I needed to feel safe again, needed to know that my home was protected. The police kept me updated on the case. The man was a known burglar, wanted for several break-ins in the area. It took a while, but I eventually started to feel normal again. I went back to my routine, though I was always more cautious, was always more aware of my surroundings. The experience had changed made me realize how vulnerable we all are. I was grateful for my training, for the skills that allowed me to protect my home. But more than that, I was grateful that it ended without anyone getting hurt. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, but also of the strength we find in ourselves when we need it most. I decided to go on a solo hike in the mountains to clear my mind. The trail was supposed to be easy, and I needed the peace and quiet. I started early in the morning, enjoying the crisp air and the sound of birds. After about an hour, I noticed another hiker coming up behind me. He seemed friendly enough, waving as he caught up to me. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Smiling, he had a backpack and looked like he knew what he was doing. I didn't think much of it and agreed. We started chatting as we walked, talking about the trail and the weather. His name was Tom. At first, everything was normal. Tom seemed nice, but then he started asking questions that made me uncomfortable. He wanted to know why I was hiking alone where I lived and if anyone knew where I was. I tried to brush off his questions with fake answers, but he kept pressing. We walked for a while longer and his behavior became more erratic. He would stop suddenly, looking around as if he heard something, then start walking again without saying anything. It was unsettling. I began to feel uneasy and thought about how I could lose him without getting lost myself. I decided to slow down, pretending to tie my shoelaces, hoping he would keep going ahead, but he stopped too, waiting for me. My heart started to race. I needed to get away from him, but I didn't want to draw attention to my fear. After a while, I saw a side trail that wasn't marked on my map. I told Tom I needed to take a break and suggested he go on without me. He insisted on waiting, but I lied and said I felt sick and Mike turned back. He seemed annoyed, but eventually walked ahead. As soon as he was out of sight, I took the side trail, hoping it would loop back to the main one. I walked quickly, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but I kept going. After about 10 minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I knew it was him. I picked up my pace, almost running now. The trail twisted and turned, and I hoped I was losing him. I came to a small clearing in it behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath. I listened intently, but the forest was silent. I waited for what felt like an eternity, then cautiously stepped back onto the trail. Suddenly, Tom appeared in front of me, blocking my path. His face was twisted. "An anchor, why did you run?" he demanded. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but he cut me off. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. Stepping closer, I panicked and ran in the opposite direction, not caring where the trail led. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps getting closer. I spotted a fallen tree and scrambled over it, hoping it would slow him down. I stumbled on another hiker, a woman with a large dog. I rushed her, gasping for breath, and told her what was happening. She immediately called her dog to her side and shouted for Tom to back off. Tom stopped glaring at us, then slowly backed away and disappeared into the trees. The woman introduced herself as Lisa and offered to walk with me back to the main trail. Her dog stayed close, and I felt a bit safer. We met her way back, and I kept looking over my shoulder, Expecting Tom to reappear, when we finally reached the main trail, Lisa suggested we head to the ranger station. Together, I agreed still. Shaken, we reported what happened, and the rangers promised to look for Tom. They told me I did the right thing by finding someone else and giving help.